Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. This is the program on constitutional government at Harvard. I'm Harvey Mansfield. We've got a program today, so we're going to have presentations by our three speakers first, then questions and answers. We'll stop at 6 for a barbecue dinner or supper, and resume at 7 for another hour of questioning, and make sure everyone who has a question gets it answered, that, or at least addressed.
That's better.
So I'll introduce our speakers in the order in which they're going to speak. And so that's the first is Bill Kristol, who's writer and editor of The Bulwark. He and I founded a program on constitutional government together about 1985. And we've been having this election analysis ever since, pretty much. I think this is the 16th time that we've had the two bills. And we are fortunate to have Ramesh, for a reason I'll tell you later, Ramesh Ponnuru. But Bill Kristol, well, he's, how should I say, he's a Republican, but a never-Trumper. And this moved him leftward towards, I think he's now a Democrat. And he graduated from Harvard and got a PhD also at Harvard in the government department. I guess I knew him then. He's had an important career. He was chief of staff to Vice President Dan Quayle in the first Bush administration. He taught at the Harvard Kennedy School, University of Pennsylvania. He is a friend and assistant to the wonderful Daniel Patrick Moynihan. You see him all the time on TV. He's moved from Fox to ABC to CNN. And he comes from a notable family. His father, Irving Kristol, is a so-called father of neoconservatism. And his mother, Gertrude Himmelfarb, was a very gifted historian. Then Bill Galston. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Before that, he was a professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. He's participated in 6 different presidential campaigns. In 1993 to 5, he was deputy assistant to President Clinton in the White House. Went to Cornell, got a PhD at Chicago. Is the author of a number of books. I like to mention always his first book on Kant and the Problem of History, and most recently, Anti-Pluralism, the Populist Threat to Liberal Democracy, 2018. Before that, The Practice of Liberalism. That's just one of several books on liberal political theory. As Bill Galston is a major figure in liberal political theory. And he writes a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal. He's, you could say, the house liberal at the Wall Street Journal. Does a very good job. And, right.
You should read my
I always read him.
Harvey.
Yeah, right. Right. And you can tell from his erect posture and his resolute face that he was once a United States Marine. So, and now we got Ramesh Ponnuru. We needed to have a conservative, it turned out. And we're very happy to have him. He is a journalist. He's the editor of National Review, which is sort of most important conservative magazine, founded by William F. Buckley. So he's continuing that. He's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Being Asian American, he couldn't go to Harvard, so he had to go to Princeton. And he got a summa cum laude, working with Robert George, and wrote a senior thesis of 107 pages, it said, maybe incorrectly, off by a page or two, possibly, on abortion. He's written a book on this called The Party of Death. That refers to, I think, the Democrats, abortion and euthanasia. And this book has been widely praised, and reasonably too. So, and he's here with his wife, April Ponnuru, who's a major figure in conservative circles. And while we're at it, let's mention the women. So there's Susan Kristol, eminent classicist and mother, and Miriam Galston, who's a lawyer and a student of Islamic political philosophy, and my wife, Anna, who's a woman about town who now has a country house. All right, so I think that'll do it, and let's start with Bill Kristol. I should say just about the election, we've had just another surprise, one surprise after another. So, except maybe it wasn't a surprise to you.
That was a little less of a surprise. For once, I was sort of right about an election, but it happens once every 10 elections or so it's great. Oh, it's good to be here, good to be back at Harvard. It's great to be on this panel again with old friends. This is the only room in Harvard, I believe, the only place at Harvard where being introduced as someone who was once a staunch Republican and conservative and now is not such a staunch Republican, maybe even a fellow traveler with the Democrats, and then maybe not so fully conservative anymore. It's the only place at Harvard where that would be greeted with groans and, and disapproval. I'm sort of more used to coming to Ivy League schools and being praised for that, but that's okay. It's a free world, free country. It's good that you can have both points of view. It's good that Harvey can have affirmative actions for people who've stuck with, affirmative action for people like my friend Ramesh, who stuck with conservatism despite all the flaws that have been exposed over the last few years. So it's nice to be we started the program for constitutional government honestly to provide more diversity of views and ensure that there was freedom of speech and argument and thought at Harvard. Not ensure it, but do our best to foster it. So I think this is very much in that spirit. I don't have extremely well-organized or elegant presentation because it's been kind of a crazy 48 hours, and I don't know that haven't really fully thought through all the implications of what happened, and I'm sure we'll all be wrong at different times about those implications, but it's a very, if there's this one thing I've learned over the years is if there's a surprising election, the surprises don't end, when the votes come in, right? There are all kinds of implications, that second, third order implications and consequences that people don't think through ahead of time. There are limits to our ability to forecast. This is, I will say, a conservative truth, a Hayekian truth, and there are unanticipated consequences. That's a neoconservative truth. So I still do believe in some of these conservative teachings. But so I'll just make really a few points of what I think, what didn't happen, what did happen, and what could happen as a result of the election. What didn't happen, pretty obvious. There was no wave. People people under 40, I'd say, in Washington, who dominate the discourse probably these days, in sort of, certainly on Twitter, but in political analysis circles and so forth, have only seen wave elections, really, in off-year elections. 2006 for the Democrats, 2010 and 2014 for the Republicans, 2018 for the Democrats, and they sort of took what is a real historical trend, no question about it, as if it were somehow foreordained and inescapable. To the degree I was more right in doubting that, which I did doubt it this year, and it turned out to be right. It was partly just my contrarianism at disliking inevitable historical trends and claims about them, rather than any deep analysis of what was happening. But it is a real trend, no question about it, and the Democrats did resist, overcame some history and resisted gravity, if you want, the natural wish of the American public to balance off a president whose party controls both houses of Congress. I mean, since Carter, every time there's been an off-year election with a new president whose party has controlled Congress, the voters have taken back one or both houses in the first off-year election since '78. That's happened at every time. And it did happen this time, barely probably, for the Republicans, but it didn't happen in the way people, and with the magnitude people thought. 75% of the public thought the economy, according to the exit polls, was poor or bad or poor. President Biden was underwater. Another correlation in terms of his approval. Another correlation in the last several cycles, really going pretty far back, is that if voters in a state think the president, disapprove of the president, the candidates of that president's party running in that state tend to lose. And that's, in a way, was a very good predictor in 2010. If in states where Obama was most unpopular, Democrats, even if they were very different from President Obama, tended to lose. Same in 2018, my congressional district in Northern Virginia had been a Republican district. Voters there, classic sort of upper middle class suburban voters, swung against Trump and against the Republican Party and voted out Barbara Comstock, who was anti-Trump, pretty much, as a Republican member who was going to vote for McCarthy for Speaker and so forth. And they just didn't want, they wanted a House. We wanted a House to check Trump, and that means you have to have a Democrat. So the nationalization of elections, the wish to have divided government, which is a reasonable wish, though sometimes maybe foolish, it does tend to swamp everything else, which is why history does produce these wave elections to check the president and the party that's been in power. I mean, on the disapproval, Biden in the exit polls is like at 45% approval, 54 disapproval, a little higher than where he's been in other polls. But something like 15% of voters who disapprove, different state by state, voters who disapprove of President Biden nonetheless voted for Democrats for the Senate or the House, higher numbers for governorships some places, but that's more understandable. It was a governor's, not a federal race, so it has its own dynamics. And that's a very high number compared to history. More voters were willing to say, I'm not thrilled with the performance of the party in power, but I'm nonetheless going to vote for the candidate of that party, whether he or she's an incumbent or the challenger in an open, or someone in an open seat, than has historically been the case. So that's how there was that's why history didn't quite obtain this time. Having said that, the other thing that didn't happen, so one thing that didn't happen, as I say, is history. It was a surprise. The normal thing didn't happen. The other thing that didn't happen, though, was any major reversal of the current state of American politics. So those of us who would have liked, for example, to see just a massive repudiation of a Trumpy Republican Party to then lay the groundwork maybe for a healthier party and healthier politics, one really can't say that happened either. I'll come back to Trump personally, who I think had a bit of a rebuke in the election, but a party that was totally comfortable with having in its ranks, at least, election deniers, conspiratorialists, various kinds of figures, didn't do terribly. You know, the Republicans probably won the overall vote for the House, the national popular vote for the House, by about 0.5 percentage point. They had lost it by about 2.5 percentage points in 2020. Biden had won by about 4.5 points. He was stronger than the House Democrats. But so just apples to apples, so to speak, the Republicans picked up 3 points over the last 2 years in the actual national vote for the House. They probably will end up picking up, 8 seats or something like in the House. It's very hard to tell. There are many, many very close races, and we don't have the ballots counted, especially out west, and some of them, they will probably end up losing 1 seat in the Senate. So again, 30,000 feet, come down from Mars. You look at the country in 2020, election of 2020, 2022, very similar. So the thing that didn't happen was a realignment, a repudiation, a dramatic move one way or the other. The surprise was that there wasn't the punishing of the presence of the party in power. The other, it was a surprise, but the other striking thing that didn't happen was no repudiation, particularly of a Trumpy Republican Party, some punishing of the Trumpy candidates. I do think if someone looks at the numbers, and I haven't looked at this, I'm not sure we've had 2 elections back to back where the results were so much the same. If someone came along and just gave even Bill and Ramesh, let alone less educated people, just the printout of the 2020 and 2022 exit polls and results, and didn't say which year it was, it wouldn't be so obvious right away to see, you got a 50-50 Senate, 51-49 Senate. The socioeconomic groups looked the way they did, some very small moves, but basically all the trends we've seen over the last, certainly since Trump, but even before, college-educated versus non-college, the sorting of the country, the separating out of the country, the solidifying of these 2 blocks in the country so that even a very good candidate can't win in certain states, and even a bad candidate from the right party can win in those states, all that remained. Tim Ryan, probably everyone thought Tim Ryan ran the best campaign of a Democrat for Senate this year. Not everyone, but he was very strong, and he lost by 7 or 8 points to J.D. Vance. He ran ahead of the Democratic gubernatorial candidate in Ohio, to be sure, so there was some split ticket voting, but as Bill and I were talking about this, the idea that Ohio and Florida are now safe Republican states, these were the swing states of 2000, 2004. Barack Obama carried both of them in 2012. Colorado and Virginia gone the other way, and a couple other states probably at the presidential level. Michigan, by far the biggest Democratic gains this year. Maybe that becomes sort of Ohio in reverse and becomes more safely Democratic. They won everything in Michigan. Who knows? But big picture, again, the country looks surprisingly like it did 2 years ago electorally. What did happen then if these things didn't happen? I do think it was a bit of a setback for President Trump, former President Trump, ex-President Trump, whatever we're supposed to call him. Trump, I just call him Trump, personally. The candidates he personally selected or endorsed got through primaries in swing states, tended to lose. We'll see what happens with Kari Lake in Arizona, which seems too close, not resolved at this point. J.D. Vance won. Almost all the others in tough races and tough states lost. So it might have been better to not have nominated Oz in Pennsylvania. Maybe McCormick wins there. If he's not the nominee, maybe the conventional candidate, the Republican candidate in Arizona wins if it's not Kari Lake. But it's not a massive repudiation. Some sense that being a Trumpist Republican was suboptimal in some of these swing states. On the other hand, plenty of other states. I mean, Arizona, which a state Biden carried. It's worth really reflecting on this for a second. It's against my interest to do so, but that's why we get the big bucks here to come to this panel, tell the truths, even the unpleasant truths. Arizona, a state that Biden won, that has 2 Democratic senators, Kari Lake is dead even. And if you ask me to rate the kind of craziness of Republican presidential gubernatorial candidates, Kari Lake would be extremely high on the charts. And yet, there she is, running even with not a very impressive Democratic candidate, but a Secretary of State who's inoffensive and a conventional Democrat. So the Republican brand has not been damaged by Trump nearly as much as it could have been, or as some of us think it should have been. The other thing I would mention that I think is worth just thinking about is abortion. Dobbs the Dobbs decision did give the Democrats, or helped give the Democrats a huge, relatively speaking, a big bump in the summer. That subsided some in September, October, but enough of it held up to make it a surprisingly good election for the Democratic Party. And I think some of that is due to the continuing effect of that issue playing through politics. Maybe it'll all sort itself out. I'm not sure that's a longer-term thing. Maybe federalism will obtain, and there'll be one set of laws in Texas and another in Michigan. In Michigan, where it was on the ballot, where the state was not ready for a ban on abortion, which is what could have happened with the Republican candidates they ran on. It was a big assistance, I think, to Governor Whitmer and to all the Democrats. In other states, it made no big difference. In Texas, where there's a pretty one of the stronger, let's call it, pro-life laws, and there was a huge amount of publicity, remember, when it went into effect, and it doesn't seem to have hurt Governor Abbott particularly, and didn't seem to have much effect on other races. So I think this is somewhat geographically contingent, where abortion has a big effect, but it remains a big issue. And I would say going forward, it remains a big issue, and then I'll turn to what could happen going forward briefly. One thing on that issue is, I think that a Republican presidential candidate who could run on a Federalist platform on the life issue on abortion would be okay, would be fine, let the states decide. A Republican candidate who has to be for, or chooses to be for, federal legislation, federal pro-life legislation, even if it's qualified a little bit, I think that's a tough sell just based on the returns Tuesday in Michigan, probably in Wisconsin, probably in Pennsylvania, so in some key states at least. We haven't really litigated that issue. We'll see what happens if Republicans win the House. Will they try to actually do something? It won't matter because Biden will stop it and the Senate won't pass it. But I think that issue is a bit of a wild card. I mean, whatever. It's a serious issue. It's an issue that people have strong opinions about. It was a 49-year Supreme Court decision. It was overturned 5-4, with 3 recent appointees making up 3/5 of the 5. Just unusual to have that happen in the middle of an election campaign. So we'll see how that plays out over the next couple of years. Republicans, I think Trump is the huge question. A lot of hopes among my Republican friends that Trump can be shoved aside as a result of this election. I hope they do. I think it would be good for the country, even though DeSantis or someone Youngkin would be a stronger candidate, I think, in 2024. There were lots of moments where people thought Trump should be shoved aside, and he wasn't shoved aside. Lots of moments where people privately said he should be shoved aside and didn't say so publicly. Lots of moments where they didn't ultimately step up and shove him aside, where they could have, like impeachment, to mention an obvious one, in February of 2022, where 2021, where he could not, presumably couldn't be running yet if he had been successfully convicted after being impeached. Let's see. I think the next few months or two will be very interesting. How many people publicly say Trump shouldn't be the nominee? Or don't just say, gee, I'm a little concerned about it, but say, nope, I'm organizing to make sure we can support someone else. And indeed, we're going to organize to try to make sure that the other candidates don't, we don't have 8 of them running and they divide the vote. We're going to, donors could do this, right? You could get together if you were a serious Republican who wanted to stop Trump and try to organize the nomination for someone else or for someone else from a group of someone else's. We'll see if they have the nerve to do that, or whether, A, they don't object that much to Trump, and B, they're not so sure that he would lose, and C, they're scared of him. And so we'll see if people run, right, if DeSantis runs, and Youngkin and many, many others. So it is very revealing about the Republican Party that Mike Pence, who was very loyal, if you like Trump's administration, you should like Mike Pence. And if you like Trump's administration but don't like January 6th, you should really like Mike Pence, because that literally is what Mike Pence is, right? I mean, he's the one guy who stood up when he had the toughest time, in a way, standing up on January 6th. Otherwise, he was a totally loyal Trumpist. So why shouldn't they all be for Mike Pence? Well, they can't be for him because he took on Trump. Kemp in Georgia, excellent conservative, if you're conservative, an excellent governor of Georgia, re-elected easily in a swing state. He should be the one they're all rallying to. Right? You want a non-Trump Republican Party that's totally conservative, pro-life, pro-market, pro-business, slightly pro-voter suppression, kind of the pure Republican dream, and they're not rallying to Kemp. Why? Because he took on Trump in 2020, and you can't be for someone who takes on Trump. So you have to be someone who's sort of Trump adjacent, who's kind of quiet about Trump, Youngkin, and DeSantis. We'll see how that all works out. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there'll be a Kemp boomlet here after his big victory in Georgia, but I wouldn't count on it. Democratic Party, huge questions. Joe Biden, maybe you noticed this, is a little elderly to be president of the United States and won't be any younger 2 years from now. It wouldn't be any younger 6 years from now at the end of a second term. He beat Trump, on the other hand. I think it's a very unusual moment where the nomination of both parties is very much up in the air, in my opinion, though Biden for now is helped by the election, as Trump was for now somewhat hurt by the election, and there'll be a sense of, hey, we did fine with Biden as president. That's the safest thing to do, just to keep him. On the other hand, you just don't know, how that looks a year from now, whether any Democrats have the nerve to really shove him aside a little bit. I don't know. A lot of other wild cards. I'll mention Liz Cheney, who had a pretty good election night, actually. The Democrats she went in to help against election deniers look like they've won. We'll see what happens in Arizona. But she's without a party, and a little hard to know quite what her future holds electorally. Final point, just to clarify this kind of forward-looking point. So if you do a matrix, assuming no third parties or no major third parties and independent candidates, which could be wrong this time, it has been right a lot of the time. So there are only 4 possible matchups in 2024, to oversimplify here a little bit, I think helpfully. Trump Biden, non-Trump Biden, DeSantis, et cetera. Non-Biden Trump, so that would be Biden decides he can't run again, and it's Whitmer or Shapiro or whoever you want, or Vice President Harris or, Buttigieg or something, against Trump, and non-Biden, non-Trump. Those are the only 4, if I've got the math right here, ways this thing can work out. The best thing for the country, in my view, would be non-Biden, non-Trump, and that's the least likely of the 4. And the worst thing for the country would be Trump versus Biden, and that's the most likely of the 4.
Well, now that Bill Kristol has demonstrated that the classic political scientist 2x2 table exhausts all human possibilities, we can we can move on. Demonstrating once again that the reign of Hegel is not yet ended, I too have 3 points. Or point 1, what happened? Point 2, why did it happen? And point 3, what does it mean? I told Harvey before this session began that if Kristol went before me, that I'd be able to cross out significant portions of my remarks. And so efficiency has been served, I'm happy to inform you. So what happened at the altitude of 30,000 feet? Well, in most midterm elections, particularly the first midterm after a president takes office, you see a mobilization of the out party and the demobilization of the in party. By contrast, in presidential elections, you usually see the mobilization of both parties. And one of the distinctive features of this midterm election is that in its broad shape, it looks more like a presidential election. There was a mobilization of both political parties, and that itself is remarkable. And it helps account for the fact that I think the winner's edge, the Republicans' edge in the popular vote, is going to be substantially smaller when the dust settles than the edge of the winners, the big winners in 2010 and 2018. Let's just use those two as a baseline. In 2010, the losing party, the Democrats, who managed to shed 63 seats in that midterm election, got 44.9% of the popular vote. 8 years later, when the tables were turned, and the Democrats picked up 40 seats, the Republicans got 44.8% of the popular vote. I don't know what the final numbers are going to look like in 2022 when all the votes are counted, but I can pretty much guarantee you that they're not going to look like that. Just doing a back-of-the-envelope calculation based on the exit polls, which means you're piling conjecture upon conjecture and uncertainty upon uncertainty, unfortunately, I would guess that the Democrats got between 47 and 48% of the two-party vote and a little bit less than that of the total popular vote, because you always lose some to independent and third-party candidates. And I think that that very simple fact helps account for the fact that the Republican seat turnout, seat gain, is going to be so much lower than almost anybody anticipated. Some people got it right. I talked to a leading young Democratic pollster at a party a couple of weeks ago who told me that the Republican gains would be about 15. That may turn out to be spot on. But most of the rest of us, even those of us like me who wrote article after article trying to explain why the ceiling on Republican gains was so much lower this time than it has been in some of the wave elections of the past, I didn't dare to predict that Republican gains in the House would be as small as they're turning out to be. But this phenomenon of dual partisan mobilization, unusual for a midterm election, helps to explain that. As Bill said, there was no large change in the shape of the two parties' coalitions. A little bit of air was pumped into the Republican coalition compared to 2020. A little bit of air was taken out of the Democrats' 2020 balloon. And I picked up one indication that Democrats may be running into trouble with Asian voters, although, drawing inferences from exit polls is risky. And if so, I think I can understand why that may be happening. But let's turn to the state level for a minute, because important things happened there. The Democrats actually picked up 2 governorships relative to the prior baseline with a chance to get a third. It is possible that Republicans will pick up a single governorship depending what happens in Nevada. And I think equally significant, Democrats almost swept the governor's races in the most important swing states for 2024. Certainly in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And interestingly, looking forward to possible voting wars in 2024, the Republicans hoped to make gains in the Wisconsin the House in particular, so that they would have a supermajority that would enable them to override the governor who was reelected. That did not happen. And in Michigan, the Democrats flipped both the House and the Senate. So suddenly Michigan is a trifecta state. Who would have thought that? And in Pennsylvania, Democrats picked up, I believe, the Senate, but I'll check that. At any rate, so in those key states, Democrats are in a much better position than they would have been previously to resist efforts to challenge the 2024 presidential election results. In Georgia, we have a Republican governor who has demonstrated his intention and his capacity to stand against fundamental vote manipulation, which leaves Arizona, which I confidently predict will be the epicenter of craziness in 2024. I can hardly wait. So there were, Democrats' losses at the national level were much smaller than expected, and their gains at the state level, in both governorships and state legislatures, turn out to be quite significant looking forward to 2024. Okay, so much for what happened. If we had a lot of time, I'd go into details about the small changes in the size of the Democratic coalition in 2022 relative to 2020, but we can do that in Q&A if anybody really wants me to drill down. So let's get to number 2. Why did it happen? I'll start with what was the biggest surprise for many. The 2022 midterm election was expected to be a referendum on Joe Biden. It's closer to say that it was a referendum on the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court lost. And I can go into great detail on why the Supreme Court lost, but suffice it to say that when it comes to what I'll call the abortion regime, you have about 60% of Americans who say that abortion ought to be legal all or most of the time, versus about 40% who say that it should be illegal most or all of the time. And the share of Americans who think it ought to be illegal all the time is under 10%. So if you're perceived to be anywhere near that position, which some Republicans were in this cycle, you have a very, very steep hill to climb. And many of them, Michigan would be an excellent example, conspicuously failed to climb it. And it is really dramatic, looking at pre-election expectations that this would be a predominantly inflation-driven election, that the number of people leaving the polling booths who said that abortion was their top issue was almost as large as the number who said inflation. 31% for inflation, 27% for abortion. And when you look at the swing states, the results were even more dramatic. There are actually 2 important swing states where the voters coming out of the voting booths said, more voters said that abortion was their top issue than inflation. Those 2 states were Pennsylvania and Michigan. In Michigan, 45% said that abortion was their top issue, and only 29% said that inflation was their top issue. Figures are similar, but a little bit less dramatic in Pennsylvania. And in each one of the key swing states, other than Georgia, there is near parity in the number of people citing each of those two issues. And I think that was a major driver, probably the single biggest surprise of the election. And I think it accounts for a substantial portion of the difference between what people expected the outcome would be and what it actually turned out to be. So, why it happened? Factor number one, referendum on the Supreme Court, referendum on the abortion regime. Number two, yes, Virginia, there are swing voters, and they pay careful attention to the character and quality of individual candidates. If Herschel Walker had gotten as many votes as Brian Kemp, we would be looking at a Republican Senate. But he trailed Governor Kemp by 5 percentage points, and I don't think it requires a detailed analysis to explain why. And speaking of candidates, indeed speaking of Trump candidates, it is true that J.D. Vance, won the election handily in Ohio, but he ran almost 10 percentage points behind the Republican gubernatorial candidate running for re-election, Mike DeWine, and I could go on. Now, this brings me to my third point, and I flatter myself that it's a bit original, but we'll see. Democrats did surprisingly well among the people I will call lukewarm voters, as opposed to passionate voters. What do I mean by that? Well, despite predictions of mass desertion among independents, Democrats carried independents in this cycle by 2 or 3 points, depending on which poll you're looking at. They got 56% of the moderate vote. And helping to explain a point that Bill Kristol made, they got 49% of the many, many people who said that they somewhat disapproved of Biden's performance as president, but did not strongly disapprove of it. The problem with looking at the raw job approval number is that it smushes together people who strongly approve of the president and only somewhat approve, and people who somewhat disapprove and people who strongly disapprove. And it turns out that that 4-point scale tells a much more accurate story than the 2-point scale does. Moving right along with our lukewarm voters, if you look at the group of people who were discontented about but not angry about how things are going in the country, Democrats got 48% of those voters. And they got 60% of the voters who said that abortion should be legal in most but not all cases. So, my thumbnail analysis of the 3 big things that happened, number one, the referendum on the Supreme Court. Number 2, the non-disappearance of swing voters. And number 3, the fact that we can see in the exit polls that people who were unhappy about the way things were going and about the president, but not really angry about it, gave a lot of their votes to Democrats. Okay, question number 3, what does it mean? Here, I'm just going to throw some ideas on the table, and very quickly, because Bill Kristol has already mentioned some of them. Just to look at the surface in the Democratic Party, if things had gone badly, I speak as a veteran of the famous Democratic Circular Firing Squad, it will not form up this year. Instead, I get to observe a Republican circular firing squad. Fortunately, their aim is terrible, so there'll be as many Republicans left standing at the end of the circular firing squad as there will at the beginning, I confidently predict, but they'll probably be madder at each other. And so this removes the pressure on Joe Biden to stand down and create an open contest for the Democratic presidential nomination. I think he was very much inclined to put himself forward for renomination before this election. And now I'm almost certain that he will, and I would be very surprised if a major Democratic candidate stood up to challenge him. Within the Democratic Party's memories of what happened in 1980 are still fresh. If you challenge an incumbent president, you probably will not beat him, but you will certainly weaken him for the general election. And unless that's what you want to do, for example, that's certainly what Liz Cheney would want to do if she put her hat in the ring as a Republican against Donald Trump. But unless you want to weaken the eventual nominee of your party, you don't do that, and I don't think that's going to happen. A second subtler thing that's happened within the Democratic Party is the nature of the issue debate. I know for a fact that a whole bunch of Democrats were locked and loaded if things had gone badly to argue that it was a huge mistake to focus on abortion as much as the Democrats did, that James Carville was right all along, it always was the economy stupid, and people should have been banging away on a progressive economic agenda, going far beyond what Biden and company got done during the first 2 years of what I hope will be his first term. And that's not going to happen now, right? And, the argument in favor of giving due attention to cultural issues in the Democratic Party has been much strengthened by this. Now, that can easily overreach. The fact that the Democrats were on the winning side of what turned out to be the core cultural issue in this election does not mean that they would be on the winning side of all of the other cultural issues that many Democrats like to push, but overreach is us, and so I'm not confident. But that's an important dog that didn't bark in the post-election dialogue. I think this certainly diminishes Trump more than perhaps Bill Kristol suggested. It diminishes Trump not only, depending on how things go, for the second consecutive election, he will have deprived the Republicans and Mitch McConnell of an entirely achievable Senate majority, but also because a lot of the people running for offices like Secretary of State in the states who strongly identify themselves with the Trump view of the 2020 election, they lost as well. I will footnote here, our mutual friend, Bill Kristol, Sarah Longwell, who makes this point, in great detail. Third, we are witnessing the emergence of governors once again as key leaders within the party and as potential presidential candidates down the road. I view this as a very positive development, especially because many of the governors are big state governors. And I've long argued that being governor of a big state is the best possible preparation for the presidency. By contrast, I've long argued that being the governor of a small state is the worst possible preparation for the presidency. And, I'm happy to argue that point if anybody wishes to contest it. Among the Democrats, you have the emergence of Gavin Newsom in California, of Doug Shapiro in Pennsylvania, and especially Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, whose star is much in the ascendancy. On the Democratic side, she was the biggest gubernatorial winner from this election. And of course, on the Republican side, you see the emergence of Brian Kemp as a strong figure in Georgia, Greg Abbott in Texas, and Ron DeSantis in Florida. And speaking of Ron DeSantis, holy cow, I mean, to win by 20 points in a state that, as Bill Kristol pointed out not too long ago, was one of the principal swing states, this takes Florida off the Electoral College map for Democrats for the foreseeable future. And with regret and commiseration for the people in the audience who come from the great state of Ohio, the same is true of Ohio. And by the way, Democrats are now going to be in a good position to resist the Texas temptation. You know, Beto O'Rourke gave it the old college try, and he didn't get close. And that is no accident, comrades. At present, especially with Republicans in Texas statewide for running for statewide office, regularly getting 40% or more of the Hispanic vote. And by the way, Republicans across the country, according to the exit polls, got about 40% of the Hispanic vote. There's no way that the numbers will add up for Democrats in Texas, period, full stop. So you now have a very substantial clarification of the Electoral College possibilities for Democrats and Republicans going into the fall, going into the 2020 presidential election. The focus, I think, will almost entirely be on the upper tier of Midwestern states and the two key Sunbelt states. And the other 44 states will be very lucky if they see a presidential candidate. And with that, I will subside.
All right, those were very insightful remarks by both of our bills. I'm here as the token non-bill. I agreed with a lot of what they had to say. I was a little surprised that Bill Galston was saying that the worst possible preparation for a president was being the governor of a small state. I think in the Q&A we should find out how it stacks up against being the host of an NBC reality show as preparation for the presidency. But you know, maybe there's something interesting there to be said. Reagan always said that he couldn't imagine having succeeded as president without having been an actor. So I wanted to make a few points about this election and then make some more maybe general points about the shape of our politics right now, which I think have not really been much changed by it, even though there was a somewhat surprising result in that what we sort of thought of as a typical midterm pattern failed to materialize. There was no Republican wave, no out-party wave, or maybe there was a kind of checked wave, a wave that was sort of counteracted in a substantial enough way that it netted out to be a ripple. And like the bills, I was struck by the fact that the people who say they somewhat disapprove of Biden's presidency and of Biden's job performance broke slightly for the Democrats, 4-point margin for the Democrats, according to the exit polls. That is surprising. That is not the typical midterm pattern. And I think that, at the risk of sort of belaboring an obvious point, I think one of the reasons that's the case is that Joe Biden is not the sort of central character, sort of the dominating character in our political drama in the way that every president from 1992 onward has been. The Clinton years really were dominated by a very personalized politics surrounding Clinton, and same for George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and certainly Donald Trump. And, Trump arguably, if you look at the exit polling on the question of, did you want to send a message of support for Biden or opposition to Biden? And they also asked support for Trump or opposition to Trump, right? They didn't ask that about previous presidents. They don't usually, nobody said in 1994, did you want to send a message to George H.W. Bush? And the fact is the Trump numbers are very, very close to the Biden numbers. People were almost as moved to register support or opposition to the former president as to Biden. Biden, I think it's a good thing. I don't say this as a way of sort of diminishing Biden. I think it's a good thing that we have a politics that is a little bit less obsessed with the person in the White House right now. But I do think that helps explain a number of things about this presidency. I think it explains some of the things about the legislative record of this administration, where some of the great bipartisan successes legislatively really happened because the Biden White House hung back and waited until the last minute to come in and get what credit there was to be had. So that, I think, is part of it, that we were all primed to expect the sort of post-Cold War pattern to obtain here, and it just didn't. But then second, this is something that we've heard a lot about. I probably have seen the phrase candidate quality in the coverage of this race more than I have of previous 10 election cycles. And that covers a vast range of things, and there is a certain risk that you say, well, the person who won was obviously a good candidate, and the person who lost was a bad candidate. So there's the danger of a certain circularity, but I do think that there is something to be said for sort of objective indicators of candidate strength, like has this person run for office before? Does this person take positions on issues that are very, very far from the median voter? Does this candidate have an unclaimed child in every county? And one of the things that I think happened on the Republican side of our politics was a sense arising from Donald Trump's really remarkable success, both in the primaries and the general election of 2016, that the normal laws of political gravity no longer apply. That you could say outrageous things, you could have these crazy scandals, you could have this lack of experience, you could behave in a kind of unprofessional manner, and it wouldn't matter. Now, in fact, it did matter, even to Donald Trump, even in 2016. And it's why he, lost the popular vote against either the first or second most unpopular presidential candidate in U.S. history, who was a major nominee, Hillary Clinton. And it has continued to hurt him. I think it's a big reason he lost in 2020. And it certainly, to whatever extent these laws didn't apply to Trump, the exception seems to have been for him only. It is not something that is transferable. And you do see these candidates who get mired in controversy, and it does, in fact, drag them down. Now, if you are in a state where the partisan lean is strong enough in your favor, you may be able to overcome this. But you are going to underperform the typical member of your party in that state. So, for example, J.D. Vance already been discussed. He did do 10 points worse than Mike DeWine, running on the same ticket for governor. He also underperformed the state auditor, the state secretary of state, 2 Supreme Court justices on the Republican side who were up. He was the weakest member of that ticket, and I think that wasn't an accident. I also think that the candidate quality question became mixed up with another question, and that is the question of democracy, the question of election denial, and so forth. It certainly does seem to me that the deeper a candidate in a competitive race was into Trump's nonsense about the 2020 election, the worse they did. And you can see, for example, Oz in some ways, didn't have all the candidate attributes one would want, such as, like being from the state. But he outperformed Mastriano, who was much, much deeper into that kind of 2020 trutherism. And I think that there are a number of reasons why candidates' involvement in it mattered. And it wasn't just voters thinking, oh my goodness, this is a threat to democracy, although, obviously that was an element of it. I also think it's just kind of weird. It's a signal of weirdness on the part of a candidate to be obsessed about this, what happened to voting machines someplace 2 years ago when there's all these issues in front of your country. And it's a sign of weakness. It means that you are going to cater to one particular person, really, more than you are going to be your own person or somebody who's listening to the voters. And it's one reason why I think some of these candidates just didn't reach the threshold of acceptability that might have led those people who somewhat disapprove of Biden, again, to actually vote for an alternative to Biden and his party. It seemed to me, in the run-up to the election, that the debate over this question of democracy and denial and so forth had gotten a little flattened, that I think it was a mistake for any of the Republicans in the House to vote against certifying votes, the electoral votes of their states, or of other states, Pennsylvania and Arizona and Georgia. And I think it was worse for them to do it than it was for, say, Barbara Boxer and members of the January 6th committee to have done the exact same thing in 2005 or 2017 because of the context of a sitting president who's pretending that he didn't lose the election and so on and so forth. But it does seem to me that, they did have the excuse, well, this has become, in our politics, a kind of protest vote, and it doesn't mean that I'm in favor of a coup, and these people, all of these Democrats who did it are in complete good standing, and nobody's questioning them, and the Democrats are putting them all forward. But the fact is, the voters, I think, were kind of discriminating on the question of what constituted real participation in the, so-called Stop the Steal rhetoric and action of Trump, and they voted accordingly. So one more thing on the election, of course, big topic that's been talked about by both of the bills, abortion. And here on the Democratic side, I think that there is a pretty strong consensus. This issue helped. It helped Democrats cut their losses, cut what would have normally been their losses in a midterm. On the Republican side, there's a little bit of a debate as to how much of a factor that really was. And in favor, the Republicans who say this was a big issue will point to things like the success of pro-choice referenda, the failure of pro-life referenda, and just the basic fact that we didn't have the normal midterm pattern. But the people who say, well, this is being overestimated as a factor in the election will look at other things. So, for example, you've got all these governors who signed pro-life legislation who not only got reelected, but reelected handily. It's true of Georgia, which was a state that went for Biden. It's true, of course, in Florida, which was recently a swing state. Ohio, which has also been recently a swing state. New Hampshire, which is more of a mixed case because Sununu is nominally pro-choice, but he did sign pro-life legislation, and he romped to victory as well. None of this, voting for Mike DeWine and against J.D. Vance is not the natural move to make if your number one issue is abortion. And in fact, there's other data what limited data we have, which is, I think, raises some questions about the abortion narrative about this election. So, for example, people who were pushing the idea that abortion was going to be a big issue in this election, it was going to make the difference, going to be a political earthquake, as Paul Begala put it, for example. They'd say it's really driving turnout. There's going to be huge turnout among unmarried women, in particular. Unmarried women were the same proportion of the electorate as they were in 2018, 23% both times. The margins by which they voted for Democrats were about the same each time. Republicans did slightly better among women than they did in 2018 when everything was, in fact, their improvement was stronger among women than it was among men. Even among white, college-educated women, constituency that's typically thought of as being one of the groups that's going to be most moved by a pro-choice message. Republicans did better among them than they'd done in the previous midterm. None of which I think means that abortion didn't help the Democrats, but I think should make us question the magnitude of that effect. So where we're left, and Bill Kristol made this point about how sort of the similarity of the 2020 and 2022 elections. And I think actually you could go back further, right? I mean, I think you could say from 1994 onward, we have been in a period of intensifying trench warfare between two large coalitions that are pretty evenly matched. And you're fighting for a very, very narrow strip of territory in between them. Now, occasionally there'll be a massive event that temporarily seems to disrupt this pattern. So 9/11, you have 2002 and 2004, which are more Republican years than you would normally have seen, or than you've seen for most of this period. 2008, you've got this amazing conjunction of total meltdown in the economy that happens, what becomes hugely visible 6 weeks before the election, coupled with a war that the U.S. is losing and an extremely unpopular president, and that disrupts it on the Democratic side. But basically, you've got this pattern of oscillation. You've got a system that is dominated by negative partisanship, where each party coalition is unified less by any philosophical principle or set of policy objectives than by antipathy to the other side, fear, resentment, dislike of the other side, and increasingly the other side's voters. And you've also got a situation in which each coalition is sorely tempted to believe that it actually represents a majority of the country, and that its setbacks are the result of certain sort of artificial constraints. If you're a Republican, so if you're a Republican, obviously, it's the deep state, it's the media, it was rigged by, Mark Zuckerberg somehow. The Democrats have their own version of this, which obviously didn't have as florid an expression as we got in 2020 on the Republican side, but it's Russian interference, it's dark money, it's the Koch brothers, it's gerrymandering and so forth. And the fundamental truth that neither of these coalitions wants to face is that it doesn't represent a majority of the country. There is a majority that doesn't like the Republicans, and there's a majority that doesn't like the Democrats. These are overlapping majorities. That's the real state of our politics, and I don't think it is a condition from which the most recent midterms have delivered us. Thanks.
Questions?
The Democrats will. I got just on the numbers here. Maybe Bill knows more than I do, but I think the two-party vote's going to be more like 50.5 to 49.5. It's not going to be 47 or 48 for the Democrats when California comes in, and I think it's going to be like 8 seats that they will end up. The Republicans will net out because the Democrats are now winning seats in some places. So I think it's a little more dramatic overperformance by Democrats. You stressed absolutely correctly the state level numbers, which are really striking. I mean, obviously, DeSantis winning by 20 points in Florida is kind of jaw-dropping. Whitmer winning by 11 and Shapiro winning by 16 in Michigan and Pennsylvania is also pretty startling, which does make governors are different, incumbent governors are different. Incumbents did well, incidentally. It's just something alluded to, but we didn't stress this point. And certainly incumbent governors did well. Incumbent senators and House members did well. For all the talk about everyone's extremely upset, they want a total change, get rid of everyone, they didn't get rid of many people at all. There were a few House members who lost in each party. What was there, how many incumbent senators lost? Almost none, right? Fetterman flipped a seat that was given up by the incumbent senator. We don't know what's happened yet in Nevada, but I think she'll hang on, and Kelly in Arizona. So anyway, just a long way of saying that I think there are a lot of interesting little contrarian tidbits in this election.
Just to underscore that point, when I checked this morning, there were 45 undecided House seats. 27 of them are in California. That's why we don't know. And
there's a lot of vote outstanding, which is why I think it's hard to know the popular vote numbers. Yeah.
California, to be technical, California's FRCOCTA voting rules make it almost impossible to count the votes in any reasonable amount of time. California ain't ready for reform, I'm afraid. Could I just could I just throw in a comment on a point that Ramesh made, which is absolutely true, and I just want to extend it. This idea of, if you think of it in sort of plate tectonic terms, two plates right up against each other, locked, an enormous amount of energy building up, but no motion whatsoever. I actually recently did a kind of 100-year study of presidential elections, from 1920 to 2020, and they divide into two interesting groups. The majority of elections between 1920 and 1984 were resolved by 10 percentage points or more. Since the 1984 election, no candidate of either major party has gotten anywhere close to a 10-point majority. During that 1920 to 1984 period, there were a number of elections that were resolved by 20 percentage points or more. It sounds astonishingly now. I mean, you had a series of Florida elections, for the U.S. presidency, and the absence of any play in the system. This is what Sides and Vavrick and their co-author now have called in their latest book calcified politics, right? And at some point, and I think both parties are yearning for this, at some point, some candidate is going to figure out how to reconfigure the fault lines of American politics to break out of this 50-50 configuration. And that's what has some Republicans salivating at the thought of running Ron DeSantis, because they are, making themselves believe that he could do for the country what he did for Florida. I'm skeptical of that, but at least, the difference between his first election when he won by less than half of a percentage point and his second election when he won for 20 has grabbed a lot of people's attention.
Yeah, and just to add to the point about the trench warfare, so I think a lot of the character of our politics can be explained by the fact that each party knows that if everything breaks just its way, it can win everything, but also that they can lose everything. And that, maybe combined with the particular character of our political class, has led to a kind of ethos of do unto others first.
If I could just add one caveat to the trench warfare, which I've used that metaphor myself, and it's true to a degree, but there's been a big shifting of groups on each side. So it's not exactly calcified. I mean, there's been a massive trade, as people like to say, of upper middle class, suburban voters from the college educated from the Republicans to the Democrats, and of white working class voters over to the Democrats. It wasn't a trade anyone chose to make, but it happened for various reasons, some of them political, some of them socioeconomic, some of them cultural, some of them regional. And we were discussing Florida and Ohio before, and Virginia, when I moved there, was a Republican state, and now it's pretty safely Democratic despite Youngkin. So winning a very close race in an off year. So, I mean, I think the degree to which it's an interesting moment, because it's both trench warfare and pretty big movements beneath the surface. So you end up looking at the same 50-50 Senate, but representing different states and different points of view and constituencies. And just to lean a little bit against Ramesh's sort of both sidesism and but political class is kind of out of touch. They don't give up. One party does in 2016, much as I wasn't a huge fan of Hillary Clinton, did concede the election, and one president handed over the reins politely on January 20th and did nothing to make the transition hard. President Obama, though his entire team was horrified at the thought of Donald Trump become president. And the other thing didn't happen between November 3rd and January 20th, 2020, 2021. And I am going to say the words January 6th, because I don't think it's appropriate to have a discussion of American politics and pretend, well, that didn't happen. And they're quibbling about what happened in the past. Isn't that kind of crazy for Republican candidates to be obsessing about what happened 2 years ago? They're not obsessing about what happened 2 years ago. The point of election denial is election subversion going forward. And they say that. Mastriano said it. The Wisconsin governor's candidate said it. That's why some people got a little more upset about what was happening on the democracy front than just, it's kind of unfortunate that tempers are kind of heated and, there's a little bit of vulgarity on some of the way people are saying things. So the good news is pretty good. I didn't mention it because I've been involved in this fight so much in a way I didn't even think of it. It was too obvious to me. But yes, the election deniers had a pretty bad night.
Yeah, so
we focused on 14 of them in our little Republican Accountability Project, and 12 of them seem to have lost. So that's good for 2024. So I think one can be a little more confident confident about 2024. The guardrails have been somewhat strengthened, though the general spirit, I would say, of politics in general, but particularly of the Republican Party, remains not as respectful of the rule of law, the truth, that's another word maybe we should just mention, and not telling big lies, and accepting election results, and being even gracious and urging people to rally behind the new governor and so forth. That, I think, remains very problematic.
So a couple of points there. First,
Ramesh here.
yeah. So first of all, of course, yeah. As I said, Trump's effort to prevent the will of the people from being implemented after the 2020 election was different and worse than what we've seen from anybody else who's occupied the presidency. No, I said that. I'm happy to say it again. I do think that. Again, this is a question of distinction. So Mark Fincham, for example, running for Secretary of State on the exact kind of platform that Bill was talking about, or Michaels, the guy running for governor of Wisconsin, who said, we're never going to lose an election again in Wisconsin. They lost. They lost by, they were repudiated. Whereas other Republicans who, they haven't denounced Trump as much as I have. They didn't vote for impeachment as I think they should have. That kind of thing. Voters didn't treat them as being morally equivalent, as being just as a big part of this problem. They made this distinction that that Democrats and frankly some of my never Trump friends haven't always made.
I love it when Republicans and former Republicans start fighting. It makes my life so much easier,
I think we need an infusion from the audience. So, can you, can a mic please be offered to her? Perhaps we need a volunteer to carry it around.
Thank you. I love these sessions, so thank you, Harvey, for doing them. So I want to pick up on the earthquake metaphor of sort of the two plates grinding against each other. I think Bill Kay is exactly right that my metaphor is getting hopelessly complicated here. What underlies the two plates has shifted sides or something like that, but nonetheless you got the. So what I want to ask you all to do is speculate. So when you get the two plates bumping up against each other, eventually you get a huge blow up, right? I mean, you get Pangea turns into continents or something like that. So where would that dramatic transformation? What are the fault lines along which it's going to occur? And of course, nobody knows. So one version is generational, right? I mean, young adults voted more than they have in the past. Now maybe up to a quarter or 27 or 28%. And they voted Democratic. And of course we have a gerontocracy who's running the country. So one version of the earthquake is a generational story. Another version, which the Democrats have been pursuing, and me too, for decades, is the racial ethnic story, which seems to be kind of dissolving out from under us. Another version is, climate change. Another version is gender combined with something like gender fluidity or gender, maybe it's economic. I mean, maybe we have a new class. So how do we think about when the plates crash against each other and actually create the earthquake, what's the dimension along which that's going to occur? Recognizing that this is, of course, a beautiful idea.
You want to bet? I'm willing to go where angels fear to tread. Yeah, right. First of all, I do want to challenge the proposition that this great switch in the nature of the party coalitions is something that's happened recently. This is a long story, but to cut to the chase, the hegira of the white working class away from the Democratic Party started in 1968, right? And it was essentially complete by the time of Ronald Reagan's reelection campaign. And I can testify to that because I was Walter Mondale's issues director. I can give you a day-by-day, blow-by-blow account of the way Ronald Reagan drove the message that he didn't leave the Democratic Party left him, and up and down, the Connecticut River Valley in my home state of Connecticut, all of those old industrial towns. You could see heads nodding. That's right. Bill Clinton is hailed as this great force for bringing the white working class back to the Democrats. He broke even with the Republican candidate in both of his presidential campaigns. Even he couldn't do it, right? So this reconfig, and decades ago, you had James Q. Wilson writing articles about the rise of upscale, highly educated reformers within the Democratic Party. So this, in my judgment, has been a continuing story. And it became a big story because Donald Trump managed to galvanize the turnout of a class that had turned against Democrats but disproportionately did not vote. That was the big thing that he did. He intensified the salience of the sentiments and preferences that they'd had for 20 or 30 years. So that's on the coalitional point, and frankly, I don't think there's any turning back. There are ways in which Democrats can take the edge off the majority preference of white working class voters, but for all sorts of reasons, I do not think that they can reverse that with any means that they would be willing to contemplate. So, to your second question, I think you get critical mass for change when unmet needs of a large number of people pile up during a period of gridlock. Let me give you an example. We have an emerging housing crisis in this country, which disproportionately affects young people. And so they're being driven out of the starter home market. They're being driven out of the rental market by explosive increases. A record high number of young people are now living with their parents. So, reversing more than half a century of history. If you have young families who cannot find a place to live at a price they can afford, sooner or later that is going to become a big political issue. Now, my assessment of what's been happening in recent years is that unmet needs have been piling up. Let me give you another example. We have been functioning with a dysfunctional immigration system now for decades. It's costing us dearly. You now have substantial portions of the population screaming that they can't find the workers they need. This affects rural communities at least as much as it affects urban communities. At the same time, you have a majority of Mexican Americans saying that they trust Republican governors to deal with the border more than they trust Democratic governors or challengers. I could go on, okay? But the country can't go on this way indefinitely. The first candidate of either party who comes up with an approach to the subject that passes the test of logic and evidence to the extent that politics ever permits those tests to be passed, and who can sell it to the American people is going to pick up a lot of the marbles. I have a long list of issues like housing and immigration where I believe there are majorities ready to be made. But the internal logic of the two political parties has prevented candidates from articulating sentiments that could galvanize the support of a substantial majority of the American population. As I said, the first candidate of either party to pick that lock is going to change American politics.
So just two observations on that. First, part of what we're talking about in terms of trading constituencies is just an equal and opposite reaction, right? So in the 90s, Republicans finished realigning Southern whites and pick up a lot of House seats as a result. That's largely the story of the 1994 Republican takeover of the House. But they alienate a lot of northwestern, upper Midwestern white voters in the process, and so the coalitions change. I think something similar happens in terms of the bifurcation of whites based on college degree versus not having college degree. When a party sort of caters more and more and is made up more and more of people with college degrees, it's going to be, for various reasons, less able to reach people without them, particularly if they have different interests and different preferences, and vice versa, right? The party that becomes more representative of whites without college degrees has a harder time appearing to whites with college degrees like they belong in that party. So that's part of it. And the other thing I would say is that if you try to think of things that would reconfigure party politics, maybe give one side a lasting majority or just change this pattern, I think those historical examples are crises, right? Something that happens that just changes what politics is about, what the arguments are about, whether that's the Civil War or the Great Depression, or maybe in some ways you could say the Industrial Revolution is obviously a little bit more of a gradual process, but still something that really shakes things up. I don't know if I can think of a time when you really had a situation of just sort of slowly mounting problems that neither party is addressing that really has that kind of effect. I think that it tends. Well, so the progressive era, like if you think of 1896 as being the big change in sort of, you end a period of trench warfare, it's that kind of the Republican Party gets on the right side of the Industrial Revolution, really, and we're going to be and then certainly at the presidential level, you just have. They run things with exceptions when they're split, like 1912 and 1916. It doesn't mean the future is foreordained, that it has to be some kind of sort of apocalyptic event that causes a realignment, but it sure seems more likely that would change things than that other things would.
I mean, I'll just put in a word for contingency, if I can just do that for a second. I mean,
Sure you can.
yeah, you like that. I mean, and I like that too. I mean, yes, there are unmet needs and they build up. I kind of agree we're in a situation of a combustible situation, let's put it that way. That's one reason some of us were more alarmed about Trump than otherwise, because a demagogue in a combustible situation is more dangerous than a demagogue in a stable, placid, country. But yeah, I think a lot depends on just contingent events, as Ramesh said, and leaders. There were plenty of unmet needs in Russia in 1880, 1990, 1900, 1910, and then you had a war and a defeat, and Lenin and Trotsky and people who took advantage of the moment. And it's not like it wasn't foreordained that they couldn't have had a different kind of revolution.
You really have moved left, Bill.
What's that?
You really have moved left, haven't you?
The French Revolution, I think, I'm not an expert on this, I defer to Harvey on Tuckwell's analysis of it, but I don't think they had, simmering problems with the class system and the church and a million things going on, and industrial revolution and the rising bourgeoisie, but it happened when it happened for all kinds of contingent reasons. It wasn't like, and in fact, if you look at history, I believe this is true. I once, 40 years ago, looked at this for 10 seconds. I mean, it wasn't like everyone in 1787 was saying, whoa, that France, that's going to blow up. That was not, in fact, the conventional view. They hadn't had a horrible military defeat. They had a competent bureaucracy. They were doing pretty well economically. Then they had a minor recession, and there was a revolution of rising expectations, and they had Robespierre, and the rest is history, as they say. And it turns out afterwards, everyone sees, oh my God, of course this was going to happen, because look at the last 60 years, So I think it's very contingent. Trump, to his credit, shows that people can do things that no one thought you could do. We'd never elected a president who hadn't either been an elective office or in the cabinet or a United States Army general. Never, in all of our history. And Trump ran, and I thought, well, he can't win the nomination. And then I did actually think he could win the election because he was the out party in a time of discontent. But he wins and he governs, and then he tries to overturn the election, and then he's still the leader of the party. Some of us thought that was for like 36 hours after January 6th, so that might not happen. But of course, there he is, and he's going to announce next week, I suppose, and will be the front runner on the Republican side. So that tells me that I give Trump credit for this. He had the nerve to sort of just go for it. I mean, shamelessness maybe too. And it would be nice if more moderate, centrist, responsible people showed a little more, had a little, took a shot at dealing with some of these problems. So picking the lock is a nice way. It makes it seem like it's a very polite and sort of you just have to kind of get that right combination on the safety, and do it. It's a little more maybe entrepreneurial than that, I would say.
Fair enough. Well, welcome to the 32nd edition of the structure versus agency debate.
Yeah, Paul. Ken?
I need to have the mic or
We have
not?
first Bob Putnam.
Oh, Bob already has the mic.
Paul, go ahead. I'll be brief. I'll be brief, Paul. I'm on a very simple point, which is I understand polarization and that the image you've been using now is this tectonic plate thing, and I think there's a lot to that. But the way it was originally formulated here was falsely symmetric, that these are two evenly matched plates. And that's empirically not true. How many years in a row have the Republicans lost the election? That is, lost the popular vote? I don't remember the last time that the Republicans...
7 out of the last 8.
Pardon?
7 out of the last 8, except for 2004. Yep.
And
Presidential.
And yet so what I'm trying to say is that's driven not by any sociological or even political stuff. It's simply driven by the Constitution and federalism in particular. That's not a trivial point because you have, of course I agree that the Constitution is not going to be changed, but we shouldn't act as if sort of in political sociology terms these are two equally matched or that they're equally responsible for polarization. They're not. Every study around says that the Republicans are much more responsible for polarization. They've moved much further to the right than the Democrats have, and they've paid the price for it. Namely, they've not won an election, or won whatever it is, 1 out of the last 8 elections. So this is familiar. I don't mean that this is novel to me, but I think it's even in this sophisticated context, we ought to be remembering that the asymmetry is false. Sorry,
Well-
that the symmetry is false.
If I could just pick up on one empirical point, Bob. I actually added up all of the votes cast for Democrats and Republicans, starting with the 1988 election and continuing until 2020. And it came out about 51% for Democrats and 49% for Republicans. Now, I certainly take your point that narrow minority losses in the popular vote have, through the operation of constitutional processes, been transformed into majorities at the national level. Yes, of course, that's correct. But the idea that there's this enormous arithmetic asymmetry between the two political parties that's being distorted out of all recognition by our constitutional forms, I think just empirically is not correct. If you're asking, do the Democrats have a modest edge, the answer is yes. Is it anything like periods of Democratic, or for that matter, Republican dominance that have existed for long stretches of the past 100 years? Not even close. The only period you can find historically in American history that looks like this is the period between the Civil War and 1896, where you can go through a similar exercise and you'll get very similar results. I think that makes a difference, right? Because the inability of either party to mobilize a stable governing majority that doesn't get overturned 2 years later is one of the dominant political facts of our time, I believe. Now, that doesn't touch at all the substantive question of who's responsible for polarization and who has moved more. That's a much longer conversation. I just wanted to make the empirical point.
Any expert, any person, any serious political scientist who thinks that the polarization, that second kind of polarization has been symmetric? I don't know any.
Well,
There are
I'm a serious political scientist.
okay, yeah. Look, this is, once again, it depends, Bob, on the time period that you're looking at. If you're looking at the period that ends in 2010, you're obviously right. If you're looking at party changes since 2010, it gets to be a much more complicated story. But this would get us very deep into the weeds. I propose a lunch or a dinner or a Zoom call to continue that.
Yeah, just to add one little thing, since I gather that was directed at me, I would say, look, I think roughly evenly matched. If I didn't use the word roughly, I should have. But the key thing, it seems to me, about the situation is, one, neither party really has a stable and durable majority. So, Clinton obviously outperforms Trump in the popular vote, but a lot of that was people who were saying, "Oh my God, no, not Trump." It wasn't like we're dyed-in-the-wool Democrats. We love the Democratic Party, and vice versa when Republicans win majorities. And then the second point is just because they are, because Republicans. The base Republican vote in almost any election, absent shocking events, is something like 47-48%. And that makes it very hard to get that coalition to change because they don't think, they're not going to be shut out. They're always going to be within shooting distance of a majority, and vice versa. If the Democrats have a reversal, have a defeat, it's not going to be a 1984 style. Sorry to bring up bad memories. Defeat that causes them, especially when it's then followed by another big defeat in 1988, to really rethink things and try to change themselves.
It's actually better to lose big than lose small because you have many fewer regrets.
Well, just because that is very important because 2020, Trump lost, but he was reasonably close in some of the key states, decent popular vote margin. And, of course, Republicans picked up a dozen House seats, and the Senate ended up 50-50, though it looked like they might even hold the Senate. That had a big effect, especially the House seats and the governors, I think, in limiting Republican rethinking or making it easier for those who were against shedding Trump in particular, but also rethinking on some issues, say, well, look, we didn't do so badly. Trump was a pandemic, and Trump screwed that up sort of, and he was Trump, and he had all this baggage, and they still came close. We'll do fine next time. We just, hang on, so to speak. And this time, with Democrats doing pretty well, there'll be that tendency among Democrats. Bill expressed it well, that Biden personally probably would like to run, and also there's not going to be a huge amount of rethinking among Democrats. They had a mix of progressive and centrist candidates, and some of this, I'd say the centrist candidates did a little better, but being centrist didn't help you win in a deep red state. And on the Republican side, there'll be a little more of a circular firing squad, though that will be interesting. And how much of a real rethinking will there be? How much of a lot of tactical we need to sort of look a little better? Will be that. That's a little more opportunity. But again, they're going to win the House, so they'll continue the 40-year string of taking one House back after losing the presidency, and they'll tell themselves that Biden is weak. So I do think it's a funny situation where one would hope for fresh thinking in both parties and is not likely particularly to get it.
As to polarization, Bob, I think there would be conservative political scientists, for example, James Campbell, in his book Polarized, who would contest that the cause was from the right and not from the left.
However, you don't want me to say that I don't think any conservative could be a serious political.
So,
just to change the topic, there's a lot of themes here that sort of could come together. The earthquake is an interesting metaphor because of the fact that we are seeing perhaps a continuation of a long trend, but certainly an augmentation of a long trend of the Democratic Party becoming the party of the elites, where they used to be the party of the disadvantaged. And so that's really quite a significant change. And the hoi polloi out there might just decide to, and that's sort of what Trump is capitalizing on, the populist kind of anti-elitist sentiment out there. And I think you could argue that Trump is the big winner of the current 2022 election, not the big loser, as the Wall Street Journal would have it in the headlines today. Because, number one, the party needs leadership to contain Trump. And the one figure that has some capacity to organize the Republican Party is Mitch McConnell. But he's a much more effective figure if he's the majority leader than if he's the minority leader in the Senate. So I think the Republican establishment has been quite seriously damaged by Trump's ability to run candidates that couldn't win the general election. So he's positioned himself in such a way. And also it's going to be very difficult for all the other Republican candidates to say, oh, gee, we got to get together. I'm willing to step down and defer to. That's not the way politicians work. And you'd have to have some figure in the party who commanded great respect, some senior figure that would have to be able to tell people, you can't do this. We've got to get behind DeSantis or somebody. So I just see, as Bill said, it's Biden-Trump. Now, if it's Biden-Trump, you can't rule out that we will not have a second term of Trump, because we could have in the next 2 years a significant downturn in the economy. The stage is set for that. We have rising inflation. The Federal Reserve is determined to bring it to an end. You can't bring it to an end without economic contraction. How long it's going to be, how quickly you can get out of it. Certainly, Ronald Reagan got out of it pretty quickly, but it's going to not be easy to turn this economy around. If they turn it around, then Biden wins easily, right? He's going to win, walk away with it. But if he doesn't turn this economic corner, then we could easily have another Trump presidency. And then you probably could imagine sort of structural change in the political order as we go forward. I don't have any idea who would be the big winner.
So
It could be either way. But I do think that there is a plausible chance we could have a major structural change.
I'll bet this should be an interesting question, but I completely agree that Donald Trump could plausibly win the 2024 election, could win the nomination, and then go on to win the general election, given the right set of circumstances. I don't think he'd be the strongest potential Republican nominee, but I certainly think that if you've got a good enough set of conditions, he could win. And that's one reason why I've cautioned against people who are opposing him among Republicans saying things like, well, we've got to defeat him because he can't win. But I think that is not actually true. And I think in a way it's sort of not even plausible, because people heard all through 2016 he can't win, and then he won, right? You sort of can't keep playing that card. But to be optimistic about it, the optimistic case that we will be able to retrospectively say that 2022 elections were bad for Trump, I would think about Georgia. Why is it that Trump-backed challenger to Kemp just gets slaughtered in the gubernatorial primary, and also the Raffensperger Heiss race? Again, Raffensperger just romps in that race. It's not like Georgia Republicans are moderate in general, or Georgia Republicans were hostile to Trump in general. I think largely it is Georgia Republicans go through a fairly intense experience of losing power, losing 2 Senate seats because of Trump, and understanding it, sort of it was in a way that it was almost impossible not to understand. Now, so the optimistic case, I think, would be that what the experience that Georgia had in that special election has now been replicated in multiple states in a way that will get through to Republican voters. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I am saying it is a possibility, and that is, if things turn against Trump now, that's going to be the reason.
Yes.
I'd like to add
Yeah. Wait for the.
I thought it was loud enough. Thanks. I would like to add a comment from a personal point of view about the polarization issue. I don't have statistics in front of me. I have experiences from two domains. I speak on the one hand as a political science professor at a reputable liberal arts college in New England, and the advisor to its conservative student newspaper, the counterpart to what used to be, I don't know if it still is, the Salient. And I can report, and I'm sure others have read about this, how timid students are of expressing pro-Republican. I'm not speaking about pro-Trump, but pro-Republican or conservative points of view, out of fear of being canceled by their friends, as well as graded down by their professors. This has been going on for some years. I'll add to that my wife and I, who are, yes, longtime Republicans, people who would not let Donald Trump step through our door, but would still vote for him because we preferred his policies, have been shunned by former friends dating back to my wife's fourth grade friend and relatives, close relatives, for the sheer fact of being Republicans. Now, I don't have any particular experience with blue-collar workers or January 6th deniers and so on, so I'm in no position to make a general statistical claim about this. But, gee, from my experience as a professor and from an academic from the middle class, there's been a hell of a lot of polarizing from the left as well as the right.
So if you look at most of this polling on questions like, would you be friends with somebody from the opposing party or from the opposing ideology, those do tend to show that liberals are, well, let's say they take their politics more personally than conservatives do, although neither of, this phenomenon is not unknown among conservatives. And I think it's gotten a little bit more pronounced in the last few years, where I certainly know of places where, if you're not for Trump, you're not welcome. I think it's a very related phenomenon to polarization, but not quite the kind of polarization we were talking about.
Yeah, I would just add, David, and this is the tip of an analytical iceberg, that if universities and colleges were anything like a microcosm of the United States, I would agree with you completely. And the view from academia is a very particular vantage point. I think that in order to see what's going on in the country, those of us from the intellectual university classes have to try to elevate ourselves out of our immediate circumstances to see whether the rest of the country corresponds to what we're experiencing. The answer is somewhere between no and hell no, I think. But we could have a long discussion about that. But I've been now to a series of conferences in the past year involving university-based, and yes, there are university-based conservative thinkers. And each and every one makes the same assumption that what's going on in universities is either a microcosm of the country or a harbinger of things to come for the country. And I think both of those assumptions are questionable.
Yes, Avi.
I have two questions. One is, we had to set up here inflation, the economy being a problematic issue. It's usually the dominant issue. You had a president who was, at best, say, ineffectual, certainly not charismatic, maybe even senile, and you had the off-year election. Everything's set up for a Republican large wave, and it didn't happen. Is it possible that people had the sense of rejection of the party in power, but the image of the Republican Party has become so degenerate with people who are 80% supporting Trump, something along those lines, who believe that the last election was stolen, so that people in the end couldn't bring themselves to vote for the sort of the opposition vote that ordinarily flows in the off-year election? That's the first question. The second has to do with, as I understand it, the Democrats poured in $53 million across the country to nominate some of these election deniers and other candidates who they thought would be weaker and therefore could be defeated. I think in New Hampshire, Bolduc won over, I don't remember his name, by 1 percentage point. And it turns out for a while they were, I guess the Democrats were nervous. It looked like some of these candidates might actually win, and in Arizona it may yet happen. But the strategy turned out to be basically correct. A lot of these people lost. But now what does it say about the system? This is at the same time the Democrats were accusing these candidates of being against democracy. There's something wrong with our primary system that allows these kinds of machinations and defers to the most passionate and extreme elements in both parties to control the nominees and therefore the election. There's something wrong when in a country of 330 plus million people, the choice comes down to a Donald Trump and a Joe Biden. So my question is, should we really be thinking about a reconfiguration of how we select the nominees for the parties? In other words, changing what is now the primary system.
I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff on the primary system. Maybe I'll just answer the first. I totally agree with your first point, and I guess maybe I should have made it even more clearly than, or maybe I didn't make it clearly, which is, yes, I mean, without Trump being such a, and I think Bill and Ramesh both made this point in a way, right? Without Trump being if Trump had been a normal ex-president, you would have had a normal off-year election in 2022 based on all the numbers of Biden's favorability in the economy, and Republicans would have done much better. The nominees would have been McCormick in Pennsylvania. They would have been not Bolduc in New Hampshire, and all these states would have been in play that weren't in play. And so I very much agree that, yes, and voters went to the polls with Trump in their mind almost as much, maybe as much as Biden. And the anti-Trump vote was as big as the anti-Biden vote. And Ramesh is absolutely right. They're both bigger than any pro vote. And so we had an even election because, Trump Biden's in power, so you got to sort of rebuke him, but Trump's the face of the out-of-power party. If Mitch McConnell had gone ahead and convicted Trump in the Senate, if the Senate had gone ahead and convicted Trump in 2021, and I mean, who knows if Trump would have accepted that as sort of a ticket to retirement, so to speak. But if he had, so I very much think, I don't approve of what the Democrats did, but because it is irresponsible to play with fire like that. Though it worked out, and it shows, in fact, the strength of, it fits with your first point, right? I mean, they turned out to be right, that the most extreme election deniers were unpalatable, even though while they looked like they were running even, with the possible exception of Kari Lake in Arizona. So I think that's right.
And that reminds me, just to sort of close a loop, that of something I said earlier, that I mentioned that the people who somewhat disapprove of Biden's job performance broke narrowly for the Democrats. But they did break for Republicans who couldn't be fit into that mold. The somewhat disapproved Biden people voted strongly for DeWine. They voted strongly for all of these Republican candidates who fit a kind of non-Trumpy, not too Trumpy mold. And I think, it's because, again, they just, we don't, see, this is a group of voters that is cross-pressured, right? It doesn't want to vote for Democrats necessarily, but the Republicans have to pass this minimum threshold of acceptability, and too many of them decided to light themselves on fire instead.
I will take the second half, or your second question, and perhaps shock some people in the audience by saying, if I could wave a magic wand and restore the nominating system that we had before 1968, I would gladly do it. Now, there are a million historical and sociological reasons why that wouldn't be possible. But if in this science fiction experiment, I could reinstitute a system of peer review and actual structured parties within states that connected the grassroots with the different elements, I would do it. You know, the Illinois.
Bill, I'm not old enough to remember, but what happened in 1968?
Well, things sort of blew up in the Democratic Party and in the country.
Are you listening over here, Bob?
Yeah, but
But the Republicans changed their nomination.
they did, and
sure.
for the
So that
life of
question
me,
is
I
who
can't
started
figure
it?
out why they chose to emulate the Democrats on this point,
Right.
and not the others where Democrats are always right. But that's a different question. So,
Because it looks more democratic to have a primary.
with a small d,
Yeah.
that's right.
And so it's you put yourself in too much of a defensive position, not to copy the Democrats in this regard.
Well, that will get us started.
And there was a conservative insurgency, right, in the 1970s that wanted that because Reagan would not have beaten Ford, would not have come as close to beating Ford as he did in '76 if the old primary system had been maintained.
And wouldn't have won at 80 probably. So, I mean, the conservative populism had its own. You should give more credit to the conservatives for having their own populist instincts and their own desires, and they're not just reacting to the Democrats or scared of looking. They're scared of looking as if they're not democratic. They wanted the new system. They were conservatives. They were conservative populists. So the establishments of both parties got steamrolled, obviously, in the 70s. Maybe the Democrats went a little bit ahead.
Well,
So is the problem the primary, or is it just Trump?
both,
Yeah, both.
because Trump is a problem in and himself, but can you imagine under the old party system that anyone like Donald Trump would get
To be
rid of it?
fair, the Democrats now have a more responsible primary system because they have proportional representation, which I'm not crazy about in certain ways. Yeah. But in fact, Trump was the nominee because he was able to win 35% of the vote in a whole bunch of states. And they have winner-take-all on the Republican side because having imitated the Democrats, maybe, as Harvey suggests, they went further than the Democrats. And, and they decided to go.
Is that the reform to propose proportional representation in primary?
It would. I mean, it's got its own problems and its own issues, and you have another Hillary Obama race that goes on forever and all that. But the truth is, the Democrat. I mean, yes, I would say yes. Compared to the current Republican system is sort of the worst of all worlds. I would say there's no establishment to control things. There's a kind of crazy. There are 20 people run, and it's winner take all. So it's sort of like when someone gets all these delegates. Trump never got to 50% in any state until he had the nomination locked up by winning. Now, he was popular, don't get me wrong, and he might have won if it wasn't winner take all. So I don't want to overstate this. But I think the combination was sort of very damaging. And it sort of fits in with Bill's earlier point, just to be clear. These things have been going on a long time. I'm not, Trump didn't suddenly come along and take a wonderful system that was operating terrifically in all kinds of ways and destroy it. And that's true of the party changes, too. But I do think he sort of supercharged an awful lot of stuff that was going in a certain direction.
I suppose if we had a ranked choice vote-based primary system, Rubio would have been the nominee in 2016, but...
Well, Mark Land is the last person between us and barbecue, so why don't we proceed?
A question that may keep us from barbecue for a little while, because I'm going to use two words that no serious political scientist should use in talking about electoral politics, and those words are Asian and Hispanic. Right, the two least descriptive terms I can think of. And yet you couldn't read Real Clear Politics for the last 6 months and not hear about the wave of Hispanic voters to the Republicans, and then more recently, hope of a wave of the Asian voters to the Republicans. So could you deconstruct these two, I think, essentially useless terms and talk about those questions?
Well, accepting that these are Census Bureau categories, it certainly is the case. If you look at the 2018 midterm elections, Republican candidates got 25% of the Hispanic vote. In the 2022 midterms, they got 39% of the Hispanic vote. That's a big change. And it's not an accident, comrades, because if you look at what happened comparing 2016 to 2020, Donald Trump got a 10 percentage point larger share of the Hispanic vote in 2020 than he did in 2016. So something is happening. And it's no longer possible for Democrats to imagine, that Hispanic politics will resemble African American politics. That was the template for a lot of the demographic determinism argument of the first decade of the 21st century. No serious analyst can go down that road anymore. I alluded briefly in my opening remarks, to the fact that the single big loss, if you look at the exit polls and compare 2022 to 2020, the single biggest loss for Democrats occurred in this Asian category, a 10 percentage point decline. However, because Asians are only 2% of the electorate right now, what you're talking about is a number of Asians in the sample with a very large margin of error, but not quite large enough to wipe out the statistical significance of that finding. So something's going on that serious political, political strategists as well as political scientists ought to be looking at. Is it possible that the conflicts over elite high school and college admissions, which have had an impact on Asian American votes in California, have gained a kind of critical mass in attention in those communities? I don't know the answer to that question, but it's worth considering.
Related to this, it's long been the case that the Democratic coalition is inefficiently distributed. You get all of these useless extra votes in California that don't actually affect the outcome of elections. But I think there is some evidence that the Republican coalition is now beginning to become a little less efficient. And partly it is this reduction in racial polarization that is causing it, because it's not just that the Asian vote is small, it's also, it is disproportionately in places that are not swing states. And to some degree, the same thing is true of Hispanics. The funny thing about the Hispanic vote, if you think back to the 2000 election, of course, famously close election, if no Hispanics had voted in that election, George W. Bush would have won the popular vote and lost the electoral vote, right? Because he wouldn't have gotten Florida with the Cuban vote of that era. At the same time, Republicans do seem to be picking up Asians, do seem to be picking up Hispanics, but not necessarily the places they need them in order to affect things like electors.
And I would just say, I think it's a good thing for the country that these groups don't stick together as, that there's a melting pot, so to speak. I said this 20 years ago. I was trying to make the case for immigration, the political case for people who were demagoguing it and saying these are all going to be Democrats. They're not going to be Democrats. They may not be. They may be in their first vote or two. They may not be. But they're ultimately going to be like Italians or Irish or anyone else. And the truth is, if I'm not mistaken, Latino or Hispanic Americans, and it's here their definitional issues, have like an intermarriage rate already of a third. What does it even mean? Are Ted Cruz's kids like Hispanic voters? But what Ted Cruz is, the son of genuine immigrants from Cuba, you can't sort of say
and
that
Canada.
And Canada, right? So you can't say that it's not legit, and maybe that's what the census will call them, or I guess it's self-selected a little bit, right? So I think, and also incidentally, the whole lumping them together is really wrong, as you know better than I, but your question sort of suggested this, but we really is wrong. The Democrats retook two of the Rio Grande Valley seats in Texas, which are totally Hispanic seats, so that seems to put a dent in the Republican surge. But of course in Florida, DeSantis must have gotten a ton of Hispanic votes to get that 20% margin.
57%.
So Florida is a different country from, I think, some of the exit poll data, incidentally, is shakier than one might think. That's why I like actual voting data, but it's very different. So great, that's good about America. You know what? Hispanics in Florida can be different from Hispanics in Texas, and Venezuelan immigrants can be different from Mexicans, and a lot of them are going to end up not being recognizably Hispanic anyway, because what is it going to mean 2 generations from now anymore? People will have, 1/4 Italian and 1/4 Irish and half whatever, Venezuelan, and that's. So I think the good news, while we're into all this depressing, cataclysmic earthquake, America with unmet needs, is you could argue that weirdly, for all the identity politics, for all the stupid bad immigration policies, for all the bad things going on in universities, the old-fashioned American, if I'm still allowed to use the term melting pot, is working surprisingly well, and the same is true of Asian Americans who have a massive intermarriage rate again. So, what is that going to mean even exactly a generation or two from now? So I think that is actually, that part of the American success story actually is somewhat, in the actual real America, this is sort of an anti-polarization point and a sort of point that Bob and others have made, Mofi Arena, the real America, there's less polarization and less identity. We don't live identity lives, even if we do sort of indulge in identity politics, or I don't think any more than we used to. So that's a somewhat encouraging fact, I think.
Well, a delicious light supper awaits, and we'll reconvene in an hour. Martha Bales.
Hi. I have a question about the public forum in which our politics is played out. And I'm rather struck that it hasn't come up in the discussion. It very rarely comes up. And that is, of course, the media. And I was wondering if any of you had any observations going back several years to the changes in the media. When Nelson Polsby wrote about the party reforms of the late 60s, he said at one point, if this goes on this way with the primaries, some celebrity will be able to come along and walk into the White House. And he wasn't talking about media, but I think it could be safely said that the result of those reforms was not to give the power to the people, it was to give the power to the media. And that was back in the days of regulated broadcast outlets who had a fairness doctrine and all that. That was deregulated in the 80s. I'm struck that the year after you can say, I'm sure there's a lot to say pro and con for the fairness doctrine, and we don't live in that media landscape anymore, I know that. But the year after the fairness doctrine was repealed, Rush Limbaugh went on the air. He could not have gone on before because he had a completely one-sided, very amusing radio program that was intended to correct the liberal bias of the mainstream media. And that was the beginning of extremely partisan, extremely commercially minded partisan media. All this before the arrival of the digital age. And I think everyone in this room has some sense of how the social media have functioned to incite anger and extreme emotion, send people down rabbit holes and all that kind of stuff. And surely that has something to do with the sort of rigid polarization and the degree of demonization that is accompanying it. And I'm just curious if any of you would underline what I said, would disagree with what I said, or add to what I said about it. If you think it's a particularly important factor, or does this election make it look less important?
Well, for the remnant that is still here, I've decided I'm going to say what I really think. Well, so I think that sort of partisan polarization is both a cause and effect of these changes in the media. It's not the reason why, sort of the rise of partisan media is not the reason why we have more landslide states and landslide counties than we used to. I suspect the fact that we have more landslide counties and landslide states helps explain why we have a more partisan media than we did. But I just think not just sort of the regulatory environment, but the economic environment has changed, and sort of the clickbait model of journalism is not one that can be readily replaced on an economically viable basis. So we for many years, so if you think about newspapers, the fact that they were able to bundle the things that people actually cared about, right, local news, weather, local sports, and classifieds, right, and then actually even before Facebook helped to cannibalize it, Craigslist helped to destroy the economic basis of these publications. I wouldn't say that we're doomed not to find an economic basis for quality journalism. I think that there is still an audience as large as there ever was for it, but right now there is no economic model that makes sense. People are searching for them, right? There's the sort of the billionaire philanthropist kind of, effectively philanthropist. There's the nonprofit kind of model, but I don't know if we're there yet. I would also add that Twitter, in particular, has had an effect on our politics far beyond what you might think from the percentage of Americans who are actively engaged in it, and that effect seems to me to be not entirely baleful, but 80% baleful.
I mean, I agree, and I mean, it's a big topic, the technology, the social media, and so forth. Which social media? I think Facebook, the algorithm in Facebook has done more damage than Twitter is annoying and can be silly and can speed up reactions and headlines and so forth. But at the end of the day, you post something and everyone can read it. I mean, the algorithm might drive more people than to yours than to someone else's. It's more like a very shortened headline, clickbaity version of a public square, but it still is public. Facebook's algorithm is genuinely weird when you think about it, because it selects things for you. You only see things that you have stayed on and that your friends like, and then and the things you stay on the most are the things that get you the most angry and engaged, or engaged turns out to mean angry a lot of the time. And then it has a terrible self-fulfilling character in a way that I think is particularly. But I guess the only qualification I would have is, I don't know, I was just reading about this the other day, so it's on my mind. Father Coughlin's radio, it's like a footnote when you read about the 30s, unless you're a genuine historian, that there was these crackpots, Father Coughlin on the air. It was unbelievably popular. Mm-hmm. It was bigger as a percentage of the radio audience than Rush Limbaugh at the time. Henry Ford's Independent was one of the most widely read newspapers in America from 1925 to 1930. It was mandatory distribution at every Ford dealership, which at that point had, 70% or something of American auto sales. And it was like just vitriolically anti-Semitic. It wasn't even like, a little bit of rabble-rousing or something. So, and of course there are many other instances. So I guess I'm slightly on the skeptical scale of thinking the media is, it's both cause and effect, but I'm slightly on it's a reflection of things more than a cause, and that there's always been, in a big mass democracy, you're going to have problematic mass media.
Well, let me just pick up a piece of the big can of worms you just opened,
right.
And that is this whole idea of celebrity.
Right.
Because what strikes me about all of the candidates that Trump in particular has put forward is that their celebrity pre-exists any political activity. And Donald Trump clearly believes that in the same way that his celebrity was a path to political power, that more generally celebrity is a path to political power, because you start off with 100% name recognition, which is true as far as it goes. I mean, I don't think there's a voter or even a non-voter in the state of Georgia who doesn't know who Herschel Walker is or was. And if you've been on Oprah for a decade, there are relatively few people who don't know who Dr. Oz is. And after Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance was a celebrity, while he was still thinking about making his move into venture capital, let alone politics.
Although it turns out we didn't know him, actually.
Yeah. Well, but we thought we did.
Yeah.
And he enjoyed name recognition. And so there is a celebrity theory that is driving the single most influential politician in the United States. And the question, it seems to me, is whether the results of this election will call that theory into question, right? Will people who've spent their lives as political professionals start saying, wait a minute? I don't know.
No, but I mean, Trump is such a massive phenomenon. I mean, I think Trump outweighs an off-year election with a couple of bad celebrity candidates in its effect. So I think, but look, it's always, that sound like you now from the earlier part, it's always been that way to some degree, right? I mean, when did Daniel Borson write his book about the image, which is an effect about this, right? That people have the image is everything, it's taken over from, that was 1960, I think, something like that. And the celebrity, the athletes going into politics Jim Bunning was a senator from Kentucky. I don't minimize it because I think it's different. The one thing I underestimated the most about Trump in the primaries in 2016, when I thought he wouldn't win, is I thought he's just another business guy who's trying to run. That happens every Republican cycle. It's Steve Forbes, it's Herman Cain. Plus he combined a little Pat Buchanan nativism, so maybe it's a little more potent, but then it's a little Perot-like. But ultimately those people don't become president. And I've totally underestimated the celebrity side of it, that he was hugely famous, and had been on a show for 14 years, which he was the hero, and which he insisted, of course, that he be the attractive hero, the kind of tough-talking, but kind of kindly, business guy. Anyway, I agree with you. That, it was so important for Trump. I would like to think that a couple of bad instances of celebrities will now deter the recruiting celebrities to run. It's an interesting question, but I'm pretty doubtful. The advantages when you need to raise a lot of money in politics and where name ID is so valuable if you're not well known, it's just a big advantage to start with, right? That I think that's a problem.
Such a couple oddities about Trump's celebrity status in the first place. The name recognition was a big part of it, but also the free media, right? CNN, somebody said in 2015, was covering him like it was a missing plane. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just celebrity, but the kind of celebrity. Yeah. It was a type of celebrity that was extremely appealing to Republican primary voters. An executive, a businessman who got things done, made executive decisions. Of course, like the version of him we saw on TV was nothing apparently like the actual way he acted as a businessman, but and of course it turns out to be, as president, in some ways extremely indecisive, incapable of firing anybody directly. But he had that image, and I don't think that other kinds of celebrity, like a rock star running in the Republican primary would not have had that same kind of effect.
The idea of "you're fired."
Yeah.
The dream of every voter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But interestingly, as I track the history of presidents, almost none of them can fare to fire people. Mm-hmm. Right? They all use cutouts and intermediaries, right? No matter how tough-talking they are, the idea of looking someone in the eye and saying, they can't do it. It's amazing.
Oh, one other thing that sort of surprised me, every once in a while, you watch an old movie, the Home Alone movie, and he's there, right? Trump has just been a presence in our popular culture forever. I remember as a teenager in Kansas City, I'd heard of him,
Look, you read Doonesbury, and he was there all the time.
Question here.
So I have a question for
You're
Bill
the possessor
Kristol
of the...
in particular. The others are welcome to comment now that we're in the Nocturnal Council, Bill. So you've changed your views a lot since like a couple of times ago when we did this, and or some of your views is my impression. I don't read all your tweets, but I see the hostility to Trump, and I feel he's a tremendous threat to the country, and completely agree with you about that. But it seems like you've also shifted on abortion, affirmative action, some other issues, and a number of people have said, so why has he made these changes? And so I just wanted to throw that out to you. Have you changed on those things? And if so, what led to the change of mind?
So I think I've changed on some issues, not maybe as many as people think, or not as radically as people think. I think on some issues I was kind of on autopilot for 20 years as, part of the conservative movement, and I had the things I actually knew about and had thought more about, I think. And on some others I haven't changed. So like the most controversial things, probably foreign policy, I actually have at least, I think I've thought about those a lot. I kind of stick with my views basically on that. On other things, I just have either learned new things, I think. Maybe it is partly, I'll come back to Trump in a second, but you shouldn't have the exact same views at age 69 that you had at age 49 or 29. Honestly, I would say it'd be kind of weird, right? You were right when you were in your 20s, and nothing has happened in 40 years to make you rethink anything, right? So that's my first reaction to this. Oh, yes, I have changed my views. I'm not going around publishing articles against same-sex marriage. And I think those of us who were against it, we had genuine, decent, not mean-spirited reasons, or we thought we did. but we were also wrong in many of the predictions we made about how this was going to be, whatever the catastrophic effects of it were going to be. So I have changed my views on some things by rethinking in general, which I generally recommend to people. I would say the problem in the world is not that people change their views too often, it's that they stick with what they're more comfortable with at a certain age and never let evidence, history, the course of events to affect them. Trump has affected my views a little bit on conservatism. How could it not? Are we going to pretend that there's a giant movement? Conservatism does a lot of good things. I was part of it. A very important historical movement. Trump isn't produced by it at all, but Trump becomes nominee and president. A large percentage of that movement, not all of it, rationalizes him, succumbs to him. Some non-trivial Trump part of it cheerleads for him. It's got to make you think, gee, this movement that I thought was a very kind of admirable, honest, decent, unfairly attacked for bigotry and for closed-mindedness and everything, that movement, maybe there was something there's always a seamy side of every huge movement, okay, but maybe the seamy side was a little seamier and a little less of a minority and a little less suppressed than I thought. Now, it's also fair to say that things changed, right? And my friend Charlie Sykes puts it, there have always been recessive genes in conservatism. There are recessive genes in every big movement. It's different. Not like movements are not the same as individual thinkers or even groups of thinkers. And one thing I'm proud of, and I think Ramesh and I very much work together on a lot of this and agree, is that we suppressed a lot of these recessive genes that were, I was against Buchanan, I was against Ron Paul, I was against I was against America First. And I think that made American conservatism, I would argue, for much of its history, on the whole, a pretty admirable movement. But those things aren't suppressed anymore. And when they're not suppressed anymore, you do have to look back and say maybe there were a little more there all along. There were people who were genuinely, God knows, concerned about racial preferences or affirmative action. There are people who think it's very damaging in all kinds of ways. There are a lot of other people who were against it because they didn't like the people who were getting certain jobs, and they thought that no one of a certain skin color could be qualified for those jobs. I don't think they were ever the main part of it. They certainly weren't the leading part of it. That wasn't Mitt Romney. It wasn't George W. Bush. It wasn't, Justice Scalia or whatever. But were those parts of the conservative movement more, I don't know. They were stronger, I guess I'd say. Just in numbers, there were more of them out there than I realized, honestly. So some of it's rethinking, some of it is things in general, some of it, most of it isn't. I haven't rethought that much, so we're talking about a limited number of issues here and a limited amount of rethinking, to be honest. But I'd say, so I don't overdo this, but I do think, yes, I think it would be weird to say, you could rethink everything and decide that you're still as much of a conservative on issues A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H after Trump. It'd be a little weird to have the conservative movement end up with Trump and not say, what was kind of wrong with it that it was so susceptible to this? Why couldn't people stand up? Why couldn't people say what Ramesh is saying here? Why did so many people I worked with and knew well either don't have the nerve to say anything or went actually all the way on board? You'd have to be kind of foolish, I think, not to ask yourself that question.
That makes a lot of sense, but if I can just one quick follow-up. Is your view now, say, on affirmative action, colorblindness, treating people as individuals, has it changed? I mean, those are phrases you used to use, I think. Is your view now on that different, and if so, why? Or is your view on that not different?
So it would depend on particular choices and issues, and I'm generally very much in favor of colorblindness. I'm not sure that the notion that the 14th Amendment requires every private institution as well as public institution never to take race into account at all. I'm not sure that is actually the original understanding of the framers of the 14th Amendment. So if we're serious about originalism, we probably should read up what Senator Sherman said in 1867 or whatever, and when Congress passed the Civil Rights Act in the 1870s, and not just say, I love Justice Harlan's dissent in 1896, but it's not clear that means that every time race is taken into account, that delegitimizes the scheme. But no, generally I'm against racial preferences. I'm for in fact, I'm the last person around defending meritocracy, I would say, often against conservatives who are now, in favor of grievance politics and excusing people for their behavior and denying people's agency and so forth. How can you expect conservatives to behave decently when some liberals have been mean to them? That would be ridiculous, right? So I hold to most of those views. But I will say this, though. I think I underestimated the continuing importance of race in American politics. On policing, I very much underestimated the degree of actual bigotry in police behavior I thought there were very few bad apples, and I think there are quite a few. There were more bad apples than I thought, and more importantly, those bad apples were protected by the other police forces. We've seen that time and time again, and that's a systemic problem. And if you're serious about reform of American institutions, you should be serious about reforming the police as well. Now, I'm not for defunding the police, I'm not for all these left-wing attacks on the police, but I'm also not for bowing and scraping or saying, oh, I can't criticize the police because the AOC said something stupid. So we have to pretend that their behavior, 100% perfect in all these cases. So that's where I kind of am on some of those issues.
Peter, another Peter.
Yes, thanks, Harvey. A quick comment first about your comments about Trump. I'm just struck that they seemed very kind of anodyne, if I think I want to say, and rather benign. What I didn't hear any of you mention was the fact that his appeal to many, many Americans, it seems to me, was and is that he's a son of a bitch. But he's our or their son of a bitch. It's also not inconsequential, I don't think, that he made his money or purported to make his money in real estate, in a game that a lot of Americans play and want to play, and Bill pointed out earlier, are increasingly unable to play. But it's a game where people know that you can make money, and maybe there's some shady deals involved, but it's a game that they can play, and he played it really well. You just seem to underestimate his appeal, and that and some of that is his genuine bile and nastiness.
Yeah, I can speak to that because I have some direct evidence to bring to bear on it. First of all, I have to say that Donald Trump's financial history reminds me of the old joke. You know, how do you make a small fortune on Wall Street? Answer: start with a large one. So a self-made man he isn't. I think it's fair to say. But okay, run the clock back 6 years to the fall of 2016. Okay, where Donald Trump has just gotten a share of the evangelical Christian vote that Karl Rove and George W. Bush were not able to achieve. I have some native informants in leadership positions in the evangelical movement, so I went to one of them afterwards and said, what gives? What explains the fact that polls of evangelicals a year before the 2016 election found that only 20% of them said that they would vote a man of poor character into the presidency, and in October of 2016, that 20% had turned into 70%. What explains that? So I put these questions to my informant, and he said, Bill, you have to understand. We think that we are in the process of losing everything. The central issue in American society is culture. And our culture is degenerating, is being transformed before our very eyes. We are facing a country that will no longer have a place for us. Forget about an honorable place, a place. We're facing a country in which what we care about will be prohibited by law, or the opposite will be taught and enforced by law. And we are so desperate that we no longer have the luxury of sorting the people on our side by character. We have to ask ourselves a very different question, namely, will they be effective in defending our views? Traditional conservatives, he said, have been totally ineffective in defending our cultural views. We need a thug. He didn't put it quite that way, but that was the bottom line. I can tell you, I've spent a lot of time in the past 2 years with some of the theoreticians of the national conservatism movement. I've engaged with them personally. I've engaged with their writings. And their view is that view that I just articulated on steroids. They view this as a national cultural emergency, and they can name one traditional conservative leader and president after another that let them down, they think, or failed to prevent bad things from happening. They hold the Washington conservative establishment in contempt and responsible for these reverses by being unwilling to do what was necessary. That's what's going on. I thought foolishly that when Michael Anton wrote that piece, The Flight 93 Election, that he was speaking for a few fringe elements, even at the fringe of the Claremont Institute. I no longer believe that. He was speaking for millions and millions and millions of cultural conservatives who thought that their conception of what made America was going down the drain. And they were willing to do anything and everything to stop it. And that's why they backed Donald Trump and continue to.
Bill, could you, is there one particular reverse, cultural reverse, that they have in mind? Or are there, which cultural reverses are?
Don't you think it was the rapidity of the change on same-sex marriage that?
I was about to say, same-sex marriage went from 20% approval to 67% approval like a rocket. There's never been, and then to cap it all off, the Obergefell decision, that was for them a real turning point in their consciousness, but also other things that have been happening. They interpreted the Black Lives Matter movement as a mortal threat. They genuinely believe that what happens in universities today will dominate the society tomorrow. And I have to say, extending the theme of changing my mind, I used to believe that what happened in universities would stay in universities. I'm not all the way in sync with David Schaefer on this one, but the question of what changes that begin in universities will have an effect on American society over time is not a trivial one, and I don't want to dismiss it. And I think I underestimated it. So that I think is the sentiment behind the rise of Trump.
So, just a couple additional things. One, I've said it before, but the power of negative partisanship, even with intellectuals, I think has turned out to be much, much greater than I had originally thought. I thought, in particular, during the family separation fiasco, I could see people who were very smart and informed. They would just come up with one sort of sophistic equivalence after another to, Obama had kids in cages too. Yeah, but there were differences. But it just had such a powerful pull on people to be on the right side. And once he became the nominee in 2016, well, we're not going to be with the other side, and we'll hold our nose and vote for him. But then after you voted for him, you kind of have to rationalize it, and maybe he wasn't that bad, actually. And he's got all the enemies that we have, and he's opposing all the things that we're opposing. And the things that he's not, the policies that he's not a regular Republican are things that most voters never cared about anyway, like trade or NATO. That's part of it. And then the other thing, I always had the hardest time trying to figure out what do people mean when they say he tells it like it is, because it's like an illustration of I think it was what Mary McCarthy said about Lillian Hellman. Everything she says is a lie, including an and the. But I think part of what it means is there is a level of artifice in which he does not engage. He does not, in some basic level, pretend to be better than he is. And we expected our politicians to do that. We expected there to be a gap between our political culture and our general popular culture where we would all pretend to be a little better than we actually were. I can't think of a moment. I can think of moments in any previous presidency where the president has given us a piece of rhetoric which calls us to our better angels. I can't think of a single time Trump ever did that. And I think that he gave people permission not to make that kind of effort.
Sarah Gustafson.
No, that was a comment to which I've gotten a fulsome response, but I didn't get a chance to ask my question, if I might. So my question is directed primarily at Bill Galston, and it goes back to your response to David Schaefer's query about the state of the universities and how much that affects the rest of American society. And I wanted to push back on your answer and to suggest that influence, I think, is much greater and more growing than your answer acknowledged. At a time when we see, and we've seen for the last couple of years, the kind of turmoil going on over cultural issues in our public schools and how that's roiling the waters. When we look at what's been going on in the legal profession, I have a good friend who was a 20-year partner at Hogan and Lovells law firm, who was summarily dismissed after 20 years of being there because she participated in a women's forum after the abortion decision and dissented from the prevailing opinion, and was literally shown the door and thrown out of the firm. Closer to hand, the woman sitting next to me recently visited her gynecologist. And at the risk of embarrassing her.
I think you've eliminated all the risk, judging from the body language.
The report was that at every juncture, this female gynecologist would request from my wife, I'm going to put my hand here now. Is that okay? I'm going to put my hand here now. Is that okay? I would suggest that the cultural ferment is loosed from the university long since, and it's now invaded other sectors of American life of a sort that I think it's much bigger than you acknowledge, Bill. And I wonder what you would say to that.
Can I just intervene while you get your thoughts together to defend it? I mean, we do need to back up and make sure that all these things that are being unleashed by the horrible universities where we are sitting at having a very civil discussion with a lot of majority, I would say, conservatives who are, I know, persecuted horribly and so forth. But I mean, I'm amazed we can meet here and we can advertise it out there. It was in the Harvard Gazette, and that there are actual professors here, you know, who haven't been fired. I mean, we have to specify exactly what is happening, and exactly parts of it are very bad, and I'm against many parts of it. Some of it is stupid and foolish, but not the worst thing in the world. And some of it is an attempt to correct genuine injustices and problems, I would say. So, I mean, we can go look at the universities in 1970 and decide they were just wonderful, you know. And this is where I'm less sympathetic. It's much too long a discussion, but I'm less sympathetic to the social conservatives' own account of their grievances as to that's the entire truth of their grievances. But they just looked out at America. They're just analytical, you know, and they just saw, geez, these terrible things are happening, and conservatives didn't succeed at all. And so I get to be fully on board with Trump, and as Ramesh very well put it, I get to move from, he's bad, but we have to tolerate him for now, to it's not really that bad, to, you know what, he's great. He's the only one who can fight and win. And so I'm much less sympathetic to that as an excuse for a kind of turning against America as it is. And I'm just wary of saying that, you know, because things are problematic in some parts of many universities, and then they are problematic in some parts of corporate America, you know, or among physicians, for all I know. I don't know. My daughter-in-law is a physician. I believe she's a good physician. The world she moves in at emergency rooms seems to be a reasonably healthy world. Are there excesses everywhere? Healthy, not a healthy world, but, impressive physicians. Healthier than it was when my father-in-law, who was a wonderful physician, was a physician in terms of relations between the sexes, in terms of harassment of people, in terms of treating people not fairly and equally. I mean, are we allowed to be a little bit liberal here, or is it all just horrible, what's happened? Are we just, and incidentally, all these people who are so upset about same-sex marriage, which I think is legit, and the court decision obviously was, that was not the right way to do it and so forth. Are they for reversing it? No, so what are they? So, they're not actually, right? Did Trump do anything to reverse it? No. So what's the actual thing they're for?
So can I preempt Bill too, since everybody's getting into the act?
Why not?
Yeah. I would just say, it's funny because we mentioned Mike Anton. Of course, he had a sequel to that book where it turns out that the original metaphor of being on a plane that is going to crash wasn't dire enough, and everything's gotten worse, and therefore we must reelect the person on whose watch it's all gotten worse. But it does suggest to me, I do think whether we call it cancel culture or wokeness or whatever, the excesses of what may in some respects be a benign tendency, they've all gotten worse under Trump, and it seems to me that that's not an accident, that there is a symbiosis between these cultural phenomena, and that Trump effectively ends up being an ally of wokeness rather than its great enemy. Because, what the woke folks are saying is there are certain kinds of left-wing orthodoxies to which the only alternative, the only opposition is just racism and bigotry, and Trump's response is, yeah.
Go.
Well,
So long.
I can remember a time when Bill Kristol was to my right.
I was right when I was to your right, and now I'm right when I'm slightly to your left.
No. Look, I'm trying to look at the phenomena straight, and I'm trying not to be defensive in response to your question. Whether I'll succeed or not is a different matter. Here's what I think. I think that the stuff that's going on in universities and to some extent is migrating into the broader society will be subject to a democratic test. And we've already seen that democratic test in operation. I think everybody can remember the summer of 2020 when slogans like defund the police and abolish ICE were the lingua franca of a lot, frankly, not only of the left and not only of people in the streets, but a substantial portion of elected officials in the Democratic Party. Is that true anymore? No, it isn't. Because they discovered that that portion of the creed was overwhelmingly rejected by the American people, and by the way, overwhelmingly rejected by the African American community and the Hispanic community. People who were ostensibly, and to some extent, in fact, the victims of bad, biased policing. They didn't think the right solution for biased policing was no policing. I mean, what sane person could believe that? Their standard view is we want more police and better police. And I would say that this democratic test, has led them and my party in a much better direction, which bears more than a passing resemblance to the direction on policing that it followed in the Clinton administration. And similarly, I can tell you that the open borders faction within the Democratic Party is losing ground because people have seen what it amounts to operationally. Immigration policy has not been the Biden administration's finest hour. But the problems with not having some form of reliable border security have just become so palpable that they can't be ignored. By contrast, and I'm not saying that a democratic test is the same thing as a moral test, but I don't think it's an accident, comrades, that same-sex marriage approval thereof went from 20% to 67% in a matter of a decade and a half, right? Because people got accustomed to the idea that despite the dire threats of cultural conservatives, that same-sex marriage was not contributing to the unraveling of the institution. As a matter of fact, most of the same-sex married people that I know are marriage patriots, right? They're more fervently in favor of marriage, than a lot of people who, grew up with heterosexual marriage, et cetera. So I'm less worried about these things in the long run, than in the short run. Having said that, I'm going back and forth now because I'm just trying to be honest with you. I think that the suppression of speech that goes on not only in universities, but to be quite frank, in think tanks and other institutions, nonprofit institutions, et cetera, I think this is very bad and very dangerous. But I detect a gathering revolt against it. And I think it's just a matter of time before this bubble is pierced. I've personally been affected by it. And I know how it works. And there are things that I won't say, to be perfectly blunt, but I think them. And to connect the dots here, Donald Trump, and I'm echoing in my own words something that Ramesh said, he made the unsayable sayable. And even if people in the audience weren't willing to say those things, the sight of someone who was willing to say them on their behalf was a source of immense emotional gratification. Almost in the same way that comedians, stand-up comedians, say the unsayable, and they allow people to enjoy a kind of satisfaction that perhaps they don't have the shamelessness to carry out themselves. This is a very complex phenomenon. And so I think these are two sides of the same coin. Making the unsayable sayable and making the sayable unsayable is, I think, the worst aspect of contemporary culture. I don't think this regime is going to last forever, any more than McCarthyism lasted forever. I think it goes against the American grain, but it's damned unpleasant right now. I'll grant you that.
Is this on? Yep. Okay. Is it on? Yeah. There we go. Okay. I arrived a little late, so if you touched on this earlier, you can redirect me to the recording. But one of the most interesting pieces of data that I saw sort of over the last few days about this recent election was from AEI's Brad Wilcox, and I'm going to read the tweet so I don't get it wrong. Married men broke Republican by 20 points. Married women broke Republican by 14 points. Unmarried men broke Republican by 7 points. Unmarried women broke Democrat by 37 points. The Republican Party is the party of the married and increasingly unmarried men. The Democratic Party is the party of unmarried women. So I mean, we can talk about. I'd rather your answer to my question not sort of be framed around abortion, because I think we can debate that ad infinitum. But my question is more about what do you see our politics becoming if trends like this continue?
So, well, the answer shouldn't. So this gap is not, I think, fundamentally a function of abortion, because it is a gap that has actually. They started asking the question in the exit polls, I think, in about 1984, and the marriage gap just rose and rose and rose every election afterwards until 2016, when it shrank a little bit, which is kind of interesting in itself. But these are long-standing gaps, and even on abortion itself, there is a much bigger gap between the views in general of married people, men and women, and unmarried people, men and women, than there is between men and women. There also seem to be other types of differences. In particular, some of the biggest differences seem to be between unmarried women and married women. I think that to the extent that we think about those differences in politics, we tend to think about cultural issues. But I think there's also an economic dimension to it. That unmarried women tend, in general, of course, these are all big generalizations to which many exceptions apply, but they tend to be less economically secure than married women, and thus they're going to view a lot of government economic activism in a different light based on that. There's also some evidence, I think what it's called the linked fate or shared fate hypothesis, that unmarried women are more likely to think of women as a block and think of the interests of women, whereas married women, and it's sort of in a way kind of like part of what marriage is, right, tend not to think primarily in those terms or as much in those terms, and think a little bit more in terms of, the also sharing the interests of the men in their lives. So I don't see any evidence. As Bill, I think, was mentioning earlier, some of these exit polls, we don't have really fine-grained evidence on which we can rely. I don't see that is something that has really grown in this election. I think it's a long-standing thing, but the proportion of people who fall into each of these categories is, of course, changing a lot because people get married later and later.
It's an interesting phenomenon. It's very complicated. I like Brad Wilcox. I know him well, but I don't. This is a problem with Twitter, I will acknowledge, which is you have to have your punchy line at the end. This is the party of married people. I'm going to make this up. There are 100 million votes. This is going to be roughly correct, I think, in this off-year election. I don't know what the number of married, let's just say 50 million for the ease of math here. 50 million married people voted. It sounds like from your data that married voters were 15% more Republican than Democratic on average. The men were a little more, the women a little less. So that means it's, I'll do them now, 28 million versus 22 million. It's just, we should really be careful to take these tendencies, which are true, and suddenly decide that every married person in America is a Republican and every unmarried person in America is a Democrat. And it is a problem, I think, when people overdo the kind of attempt to say, therefore it's the party of X, it's the party of Y. So I think the absolute numbers of these groups matters a lot. And it's one interesting thing I recommend, you can get this data easily, is look at the percentage of the voters of each party who are in a different category as opposed to the percentage of the categories. It's the same number, obviously, it's just cutting it in the opposite way. And there's nothing fancy about this, but it is striking when you look at it that way. There are a heck of a lot of married people who are church-going, and who have not been divorced 3 times like Donald Trump and, et cetera, and playing around with porn stars and stuff, who are Democrats. There really are like tens of millions of them. There really aren't enough, single married female graduate students to produce half the votes in the country on last Tuesday. And there is, believe me, I engaged in this caricature a long time, and there's the, from the right about the left, and the left has a similar caricature on the right. Every single Republican and conservative is a Trumpist lunatic, who shows up at rallies with, says he's very upset about the cultural degradation of things and shows up at rallies with, horrible things written on his T-shirt with his kid in tow, right? So both are unfair, but the absolute numbers do matter. And what's striking about our parties, I wish there were less polarization, is they actually do have large numbers of of all these different categories, which is good.
Marriage tends to bring the sexes together.
I'm going to...
Strange, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can I finish? Yeah. Strange, isn't it, that people who tend to believe that there's no differences between the sexes most illustrate that difference.
Can I pitch in just a minute
Yeah.
before we go to the next question?
Yes.
Stefan Coligno, and I used to teach European integration across the street. Nowadays in Europe, there are nearly everywhere people who are asking, how much can we rely on America? And with the Republican Congress and people saying we are not going to give a blank check to Zelensky, etc., the question is, where is that leaving us as Europeans? And then projecting forward with Trump presidency coming back, how can Europe assure its defense? Now, this is a question everyone is asking in Europe, and I wonder if you have an answer. But listening to the discussion here, I also wondered, is there something, what is going on in terms of the cultural change in the United States, that people are no longer proud to defend what they thought were these deep American values internationally?
It's when I just did a Zoom this morning with people in Berlin, trying to reassure them, and I think correctly that support in America for Ukraine is quite strong, that the Republican Congress is not, there's only going to be one Republican House of Congress, and very narrowly at that, and they're not going to cut off aid. They couldn't cut off aid anyway. Presidents are very strong. And that actually, if you had told me 5-6 years ago when Trump ran and won on a literal America First platform, that was his term, and that term has a history. And I remember at the time saying, we can't use that term, or he's going to really pay a huge price for using a term that was pretty discredited in 1940-41, I thought. He paid no price, and a lot of people just adjusted the term. To be fair, decent people sort of massaged the term so they could make it into sort of a cousin of Reaganite, conservative internationalism. Anyway, if you told me after 6 years later, NATO would be strong, maybe stronger than ever, that apart from the Brits getting out, which wasn't our fault, I don't think, or Trump's fault for that matter, with Brexit, that the EU integration is okay, that the East, and the sort of solidarity with Ukraine's been much stronger than people thought it would be a few years ago in the EU. I think that's a fairly good news story. So I think America is okay. I think a second term of Trump would be a real test of whether America wants to continue to play the role it has. It's not, the Europeans should be honest, should be cold-blooded and open-eyed about what's happening over here. I don't go over there. I mean, I do speak a lot to Europeans and try to mostly reassure them, but I don't tell, you got to tell the truth also, which is, you got to think hard about your own defense spending and about other ways of helping strengthen things back here, take away some of the irritants that would make it easier for Trump to say that they're not spending any money on defense and so forth. But actually, I would say the Biden administration, Bill made this point in passing, but I'm just going to, the Biden administration is not a McGovernite administration. I mean, it got out of Afghanistan, which I think was a terrible mistake, but it's kind of pretty forward-leaning in its foreign policy in terms of alliances, and doesn't want to, not Carter didn't achieve, only we can get those troops out of Korea as soon as possible. And so I feel pretty good about the possibility, and if we get beyond Trump, I'd say the Republican Party is still pretty internationalist down at the level of mixed, the level of Congress. So if you could get beyond the Trump phenomenon, I actually think you could claim that you're closer to an old-fashioned American foreign policy with liberal internationalists and conservative internationalists than we are to a total break with the last 80 years. But I worry about it because 4 years of Trump, we made it through. Biden is, I think, fairly sound, but not super good at explaining this stuff to the American public and stuff. But anyway, just to get back to the election, it wasn't as if people running on America First particularly helped themselves in the race, right? I mean, that does not seem to have been a particularly attractive part of the Republican message. And the more they focused on just inflation and things like that, or conservative governance, I think they were better off. So I'm slightly more, I would be somewhat reassuring.
I'd be a little bit less reassuring, just because I probably spend more time than is good for me looking at trends in public opinion surveys, and the share of Republicans who say that they think it would be better to spend the money that we're sending to Ukraine on things at home has risen quite dramatically since March. And the next senator from the state of Ohio, said and never retracted, I can just about quote this, he said, to be honest, I don't really care what happens to Ukraine. And that's what America First means in practice for a whole lot of people at the grassroots level. You know, they put it in the same category as foreign aid. This worries me. And I wish I were confident, you know, that the next Speaker of the House would stand up to this. But of course, he's the one who opened up the whole issue with an injudicious statement which he has not retracted about 4 weeks ago. So, you know, I think that if I were in Europe right now, I would be in a sort of a trust but verify mood. And I wish I could tell you that America is going to be as solid as the Rock of Gibraltar for the next 75 years. I can't honestly say that.
When was it? I mean, look, I was editor of the Weekly Standard. We started in '95. The first editorial I wrote with Bob Kagan was an attack on Republicans who were voting to prevent Clinton from helping defeat Milosevic, from helping in Bosnia, who wanted to cut off funds for that in '95. And that was being led by Phil Gramm, and it was the key to his presidential campaign, he thought. Dole, to his credit, and McCain and the others beat it back. So I would just say I don't disagree with anything Bill says. It's hard to balance these things. You have some new members coming in, but in the near medium term, the Republican Congress is not going to cut off aid to Ukraine. I don't even think it'll be a priority, even if Kevin McCarthy, who's less responsible than McConnell, they certainly don't have the votes in the Senate. Biden can beat it back easily. So, and I'm actually encouraged, aren't you? I mean, don't you feel like it's now mainstream Democratic talking points to say, we're the party of liberal internationalism. We love our allies. We love the alliances, including Japan. I mean, not just Europe even, but I don't know. Don't you feel sort of heartened by that?
Yeah, I do. I trust my party. It's the other party.
Yeah, well, no, I take that. And I trust some of the Republicans if Trump is a huge problem. And look, that number is entirely driven by, don't you think, by Marjorie Taylor Greene type agitation. I mean, voters out there aren't independently deciding, gee, you know, I looked carefully at the situation in Ukraine and $5 billion was reasonable, but $40 billion is too much. It's that there's always been a market for a certain kind of isolation. Anyway, I don't know if we really disagree.
Yeah, so my concern would be what happens to energy prices. And it's not just a concern that is confined to the United States. I would worry about the resolve of some of the allies under those circumstances, in some ways more, since they're sort of more exposed. I think as the scenario that is problematic for this next Congress would be you've got a narrow majority. McCarthy can't pass anything without keeping everybody in line, and if there are enough people on the right who have decided to prioritize the Ukraine thing, then it becomes a problem.
I don't think he would have the votes. I mean, do you think some of the Republican members would stick with him if he said, I want to cut off aid to Ukraine?
I think what would happen would be chaos, you know, a couple failed budget votes, maybe, you know, some
but I'm
budget
saying Gallagher, it's not like there are no Republicans left in Congress.
No, absolutely, totally true.
Including quite right-wing ones and ones I don't approve of in other ways who've been very good.
No, but I think in some ways, if he had a bigger wave, actually, this would have been easier. Because it's not like McCarthy actually cares one way or the other.
Yeah.
It's good that we end with a question about foreign policy, which raises maybe bigger issues than were raised before or in this election. So it's good because we may be facing a possible renewal of something like a Cold War.
Let me just say something personal at the end, by way of thanks. I mean, Harvey, you started this 30 years ago by my reckoning, and you've kept this institution going, and I know I look forward to it every 2 years. I don't think I'm alone, and I'm grateful for your commitment to this kind of dialogue. I really am.